Raigan Burns is a developer and core member of Metanet Software, best known for his part in creating the N, N+, and NPlusPlus platformers. Raigan, welcome to the No Frauds Club. I actually wanted to completely dive right into this one because the first question I have for you is actually about player freedom and also about the skills that you test in your games, because I'm always a sucker for games that are actually challenging. And I say actually, we'll get into like fake difficulty, I think, a little bit later on in this talk. But I wanted to ask you about how you decided what skills to test for. Now, I know that because the N line of games has always had, it's been going on for so long since the very original one, and that's also when you guys made some of the initial foundational decisions to how the movement system should work, for example, where it's more acceleration-based than it is than what you see in, like, the Twitch platformers that you would normally, like the snappy inputs and stuff, right? Just looking at Mario, for example.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how you came to those conclusions, you and Mayor over there, Mayor Shepard. How did you guys come up with the idea for this system, and what made you decide? Was it a conscious decision that we're going to do something different, or was it more like let's fiddle around and experiment? Talk to us about how that actually sort of came together.
Okay. Oh wow, it's a big topic. I mean, okay. First of all, definitely it was not. I think that what has been really great and rewarding for us iterating on it is that initially the game N was basically, we were in computer science at U of T and we knew how to program, and we thought oh yeah, well, we know how to program, so let's make a game. And then then we realized, oh wait, we know how to fill out the inside of functions, but we have no concept of how. So basically then began a 4-year process of trying to make a game and learning and having all these pieces. We had a little rag doll, we had all these little tech demos, and basically was 6 weeks. There was a Flash Games contest, and we were okay, I think we could actually make something. Let's just throw what we have together. And so a lot of the decisions that ended up being very impactful were very much done based on intuition. It's not just that. It was also 4 years of we'd walk home from a night out and chat about various concepts of control and input. We have lots of strong opinions about those things. So it was informed by that. But there were certainly, what I was trying to get at is, the thing about N++ is we had enough time and hindsight and also learning and personal growth that we could look back and better appreciate what worked and what didn't and why the things worked. So in terms of testing the skills, we just got lucky in that the set of hazards and the movement mechanics of N ended up being rich enough that and it's really hard to explain if you're not familiar with the game, but basically there's just 3 inputs, left, right, and jump. But in concert with the specific environment, like the angle you're on and your momentum, it produces essentially macro inputs where there's the double jump, where you jump from the floor and then off the wall. And it's essentially using the 3 buttons, you compose kind of macro sequences of inputs that create meta moves or something. We don't know how to describe it, and we never really think about it like that. It's just that in hindsight, that's what is fun about it, is that the inputs are simple, but the context of where you are and how you're moving makes it so that there's a quite rich range of options in terms of your future trajectories. And so in terms of the skills that, we aren't super, we're old at this point, but even when we had young reflexes, we weren't super into that kind of twitchy thing. And we were very much into Super Mario World, but also Elastomania was a freeware game we were really into, where you actually, Elastomania Redux or Elastomania Reboot, I forget what it's called, just is out on Steam, I think last week or this week or something. So you can check it out. It's basically a physics-based side view bike game where, I guess it's kind of like a slower paced Trials, but you have a tremendous amount of inertia. And Soldat was another huge influence, where the character there has inertia. And Soldat actually, that's where we got the idea for vertical momentum, is that in Soldat, it didn't have wall jumping or anything, but it had jump and a jetpack. So if you jumped and then jetpacked, you'd get an exponential higher flight. And so we thought, well, that would be fun in a platformer. That might be fun in a platformer. So to rewind to the actual question, in terms of the skills, it's just a function of we've spent years making levels, and the level making process I feel like is very similar to visual art or music, where you might start with an idea, and sometimes you start with an idea and it's good, and you follow it and you embellish it, and then it works out great. But more often you start with an idea, and then in the process of making it, there's a happy accident, or you realize that idea sucked, but then you see something else. So you're constantly learning. And I think all the different tricky things and the secrets that we put it in, and there are some like really specific jumps and highly technical maneuvers that you never need to know to just beat the game, but you do need to know to 100% it, where they just fell out of the level design process, because it's essentially like you make a setup of particular tile geometry and particular objects, and then you just try moving through and you see what's possible. And there are certain things that we discovered where it's like, this is okay, we just discovered this crazy thing that can happen, but it's way too hard and technical to ever put in the main game. But at the end of development, like, we didn't plan on having all the secret stuff in NPlusPlus, but it was something that just various threads came together at the end. And then we just happened to have a pile of stuff that didn't fit in the main game, but we realized, actually, this is perfect for people who've beaten the game and they want a harder grade of challenge, and they want the gloves to come off, kind of thing. Because it was like a whole class of challenges where it's not necessarily, almost none of it tests your reflexes. Most of it tests your ability to predict what's going to happen. Like, that's what the inertia does. But a lot of it is about, actually, it's not about the inputs. It's about the mental game of routing. It's about conceiving that something is possible. That, I can actually do this kind of jump, right? The knowledge that you can do a certain thing is what unlocks the ability to do these special challenges. And when you start the game, you don't know these things, and it's something that you only really learn playing it. And we hint at some of the stuff in the intro levels, like the basic stuff you need to know we hint at. But a lot of the things we just never explained. Like, for instance, there's jump pads in the game where when you touch them, they shoot you into the air. Those, I think, were directly inspired by Quake 3, which had like the exact same kind of construct. Anyways, during development, we added input buffering, which is like just essentially give the player a timing window so that they can press jump a bit early or late. It doesn't have to be frame precise, because previous versions of N were frame precise, and it was a kind of difficulty that we didn't feel was adding anything to the game, and was actually inhibiting a lot of people from enjoying it. Anyways, when we added input buffering, there was a bug with the jump pads, where if you hit a jump pad and then you press jump, the buffer would trigger even though you were in the air. So essentially you got a double jump and you went even higher than normal. Long story short, we fixed that bug, but we added a special test for that case so that we never mention it in the game. And I think you only need it literally once. You need it once, but it comes in handy often, where if you press jump, exactly when you hit the jump pad, you get an extra high bounce. So it's kind of like, there are a few hidden things like that that just kind of fell out of the development process that we thought were fun to leave in, because it adds something for expert players. And I just love when you discover things in a game and the game's not hammering, like, it doesn't pause and then there's text and it's like, hey, do this, go over there, jump through this hoop. Instead, it's like the Super Mario World thing of like, oh, hey, there's a key there. And what's the key? I don't even know how to get to it. Okay. Oh, hey, wait, no, there's a keyhole. Well, I bet the key has something to do with the keyhole, but I don't know what. And it's not telling me I have to do it or even how to do it. I don't know. To me, that's like what excites me about games, is that you can create situations and deliver them to the player. And because they're in a simulation, the player can poke at the world and the world responds. It's like, kind of like a dungeon master it's kind of a very narrow range of what can happen in a platformer, but you can make it comprehensive. And so that the player can poke however they want, and it won't break, but it will give them feedback, and it'll help them learn what works and what doesn't and what's possible, without you explicitly telling them, like, oh yeah, you can do this, you can do that, and you can do that, kind of thing. I don't know. I don't even know if that answered the question, honestly.
That's fine. These are just starters, and where we go, we go. So one of the things you touched on is that simple rules basically if given the right framework, particularly the levels and the components therein, that's where emergent design or emergent gameplay can sort of fall out of it, right? And so you learn as you go in the level design aspect, you learn as you go in terms of like what the player's expectations are meant to be. Another thing that you mentioned is that the game, some of the levels don't require the same mechanics as others, and many of the levels are easy to complete, but the game itself is very, very difficult to 100% to full clear. I wanted to ask you about that as well, because this seems like a brilliant, in my estimation, way to design a game that is meant to be not necessarily like you must replay it, obviously, and not necessarily you must master all of the mechanics. But if you wanted to make a game that was sort of like easy to learn, hard to master, then one way to do it would basically be to, sort of serve up all these challenges and say, well, these are here, but you can also just walk out the door right there. That's also fine. And so by allowing players to basically choose their own path and decide, well, I want to beat this challenge, but I can't yet. So I guess I'll come back to it and I'll just beat the level. How early on, essentially, in your development process, did you realize the value of this decision? And what do you think of this decision to make it so that it is easy to complete a level, but significantly more involved to actually full clear it? Do you guys have any thoughts overall on like whether or not this is something to keep for all games? Do you think this is a universal good? Like some thoughts on this process overall?
I mean, definitely, I do want to point out that we feel like NPlusPlus came out way better than we could have possibly hoped as a result of serendipitous developments and kind of synergies between things. So one of the things is definitely when we set out to make NPlusPlus, there were two explicit, there are kind of two decisions that led to what you described. One was we wanted it to be easy for people who didn't know that N or N plus existed, where they could just pick it up and it would teach them, and it would be a very gradual learning curve, because frankly, N's learning curve was like an immediate cliff that alienated a lot of people. So we thought, okay, we want it to be more gradual, but at the same time, we were cognizant that for the hardcore fans, they had been playing the game for more than a decade. They were really good at the game. So we wanted to find a way that we could make it fun for beginners and also fun for people who were better than the game, a bit better at the game than us. And the layered challenges thing, I mean, the secrets are a big part of that, and that happened later. But right out of the gate, we realized specifically the way the gold was designed. In previous versions of the game, we just didn't have a lot of, when we made N, we had zero, actually, that's not true. Mare made a game in university, but I had zero game making experience. So we were just kind of riffing and whatever. But by the time we made N++, we realized, okay, here's the plan. From the very beginning, we knew the gold is no longer just there like in Mario. The gold is now very explicitly an integrated hard mode, where if you want to just beat the level, you don't have to care about the gold. You just run for the level, and it makes a lot of the levels trivial or a lot easier for new players. But if you want to get all the gold, some of the levels become, getting all the gold in some of the easier levels is harder than beating the very hardest level. And I mean, it's chaotic, because it means that there are some completionists who sit down and they're like, I don't know anything about the game, but I must have all the gold immediately. And it actually makes the game worse for those people, because it's brutal and it's just impossible in some cases if you're new to the game to get all the gold. But in exchange for maybe having a bad experience for that small subset, it definitely enabled catering to a really wide range of players. And also, frankly, the number of levels we made was another. We didn't anticipate the knock-on effect of that, but by having a huge pool of levels, we could make the difficulty progression very gradual and just basically just make it keep going, right? There's just, no matter how good you are at the game, there's always a challenge that's just past your current skill level. And so you can just keep going and keep going and keep going. In terms of if you've beaten all the levels, well, you can go back and get the harder gold. If you've gotten all the gold, well, now you have secret challenges to deal with. And I mean, just to briefly explain what those even are, it's similar to the gold in that it layers additional routes, or the way that the levels work is they're just single screen static things. So the routes are kind of implicit in what is placed where. And so, for instance, one of the challenges that we use a lot, because we're just like, we loved how weird it is as a feeling, is don't get any gold. And so like suddenly now gold becomes essentially a big mine, a big hazard. And it completely subverts your previous experience with those levels. And also like the path that you have to take is completely undone. And like, so all the secret challenges are function that way with the 5 elements of the game that you can touch to change their state, like the gold, the toggle mines that are kind of safe circles, then you touch them and then they become kill hazards. And then switches that open and close doors, and the evil ninjas that spawn ghosts that follow you. Like the challenges are all based on get all of those or get none of them. So some might be don't touch any item in the world, and some might be touch all of them. And like I'm really happy that we came up with secrets. It was the like 11th hour. Like the story of it is basically the game was supposed to ship in 2014. Summer of 2015, or early, like I guess it was March. And we knew we had to ship by the end of summer. We're not like close to shipping, so we decided we're not going to GDC for the first time ever in 10 years at that point. And so we just hunkered down and we're trying to do work. And that's when we had this idea. And I'm so glad we didn't go to GDC, because it just like was such a transformative idea. We're just like, we had to do achievements, which we're kind of with Chris Hecker on the idea of achievements is fundamentally flawed and I don't like them. But if you're going to have them, we thought, let's make them interesting. So we thought, okay, how can we kind of subvert things? So there was a level that I knew you could beat without pressing jump or right. You could beat it just by pressing the left button. So we had a challenge like, beat a level just by pressing the left button. And it was up to you to figure out. I mean, I think there are more levels where it's possible, but we knew there was at least one where it was possible. And so another challenge, we thought it was like, okay, don't touch any gold. And then we were going through the levels trying to find like, what would be good for this one? Because it was kind of keyed on a specific level for that one. And then we kind of realized, it's pretty broadly applicable. And then that got us, then we just followed that. We're like, okay, well, we also had a challenge like touch all the toggles. Okay, well then essentially we realized, it was obvious to us, okay, there's the 5 things, now we have this system, and now we just need to, like, the problem was, at this point, it was like 6 months away from launch, we still hadn't finished all the levels, and now we had just given ourselves the task of, for each of like, about 800 levels, make more. Like, now you need to make a complete second path through the level by remixing what's there. And it was like a huge, like, that's when we started working like weekends and evenings. And we basically just worked, like, it was brutal and it was not for our health. But like, we survived it. And like, it still are physically took years to recover from. But I'm glad we made it happen, because I think it just adds a tremendous amount. Like, especially watching people, like watching the expert players on Twitch and watching the community on Discord go through the secret challenges. It was like something that for the first 2/3, maybe 5/6 of development didn't exist and wasn't even a concept. And for it to become so integral, I mean, honestly, it's like par for the course in terms of the history of the development of this game has been a series of like just doing something without overthinking it, and then in hindsight appreciating the value of those decisions, and maybe even appreciating why we made them, even though we didn't understand it at the time. So, and sorry, like to say something more of substance and less just anecdotes, I really do think, like you were saying, the plan moving forward, or like, is that what I think should be in every game? The way that the gold functions as an easy, hard difficulty switch without ever needing to like pause the game or to even give, like, even just giving players that choice is framing it in a way that I think is a bit negative. And it's hard to get away from that, right? If you give players a toggle or you're just saying choose your difficulty, there's a lot going on there that I think is just bad, and it would be better to just remove. And so the way that you can do it on a per level basis, even on a per run, like you can start out not intending to get all the gold, and then you got most of it accidentally. You could be like, okay, great, now I'm going to grab it. Or you can start out wanting to get all the gold, and then you hit a cliff and you're just so frustrated, and then you can say, you know what? I'll get it next week. I'll get it later when I'm better at the game. For now, I just want to get to the next level. Like, it definitely enables fun. And I think that's the important part, is that it enables it. It doesn't force it, and it's not telling you anything or assigning value to anything, really. It's just providing more options for the player to have fun. Like, which I think that's just kind of it's been our whole design ethos for the series. It's kind of like a box of chocolates or popcorn or something, right? Where we don't want to tell you how to get through this level. Like, there are a few levels where there's a specific path, but like 99% of them are very open-ended, because we feel like playgrounds are more fun than a series of hoops, and like we're treating you like a trained animal. Like, we want to just give you a bowl of popcorn and you can snack on it as much as you want, like, but you don't. I don't know. Just basically box of chocolates. That's what we're into. I think it's like, I only realized this today or yesterday, because the Eggplant podcast is doing a series on Super Mario World, and they posted a quote from Miyamoto where, like, he likened the Mario games to like a series of playgrounds that you have in your pocket, kind of thing, or it's like a bunch of playgrounds. And I hadn't realized it, but probably that is a very huge subconscious influence. I mean, obviously, the way that the secrets work is a direct ripoff of Super Mario World, like, explicitly so, because we always wanted to copy that idea of secrets that are in plain sight, stuff that doesn't make sense, that uses the game's normal mechanics in weird ways. So we completely ripped that off of Super Mario World. But the ethos of the levels are broad and open-ended, and there's multiple routes, and there's a lot of freedom for the player to express themselves. They can make it harder, they can make it easier just through how they play. Was definitely super influenced by the Mario games, even though I didn't know until very recently that was like an explicit part of their design. But yeah.
Yeah. So what it sounds like to me, then, my takeaway from this is that actually achievements did do at least one good thing in gaming. That's what it sounds like.
I mean, it's funny because every time we've run into kind of a platform mandated feature, like to put N Plus on the 360, we had to have multiplayer. Like, live arcade games all had to have multiplayer, and with single player, and that's what got us. Like, once we tried co-op, we realized, oh wait, actually, there's something there. We didn't. It was hard in N Plus because all we could do was levels using the existing things. When we set out to do NPlusPlus, we started by designing new entities that allowed more player interaction indirectly with each other, because we knew there was unrealized potential. But anyways, yeah, the co-op is a co-op and competitive multiplayer in NPlusPlus only exists because Microsoft forced us to add it. We never would have done it on our own prerogative. We thought the idea was stupid. And then we tried it. We're like, actually, this is super fun. And honestly, it's more fun than the single player. Like, I feel like the race mode in NPlusPlus is the best part of the game. And like, the single player is fun, but it's just a way of training for the race mode.
Yeah, I've heard you describe that as the final mode, or the real game almost, in a way. So it's interesting to think about it that way, because obviously you talked a lot about, like, specifically your quote about how giving a toggle or giving, like, difficulty selection does frame it in a way where, well, you're kind of not as good if you pick this option. And it's also usually something that can't be toggled off or changed later on in the same run, or certainly not without, like, maybe reloading something or whatever. I'm thinking of, some RPGs will allow you to change difficulties in the middle of the game, but it's not nearly as seamless, and it's usually not even changing the same things. So I wanted to get your take on, and this is speaking more broadly, you can use specific examples if anything comes to mind, but fake difficulty in games is something that I am notoriously allergic to in my own sort of space. I find it really disingenuous if I crank a difficulty slider, it's always comical when it is a slider, but if you crank a difficulty slider and then all that happens essentially is that there's more stats, more numbers being thrown around, the math has received a multiplier, that feels very disingenuous, because what I'm really looking for is, well, I think I know how to play this game. I have the audacity to select the highest available difficulty. So, then treat me like, a player who understands the game deeply and then is expected to use all of the skills or many of the skills. Ideally I'd be able to express my own play style and do my own things to shift the game in a certain direction. Maybe if it's a shooter and I like, short range weapons, ideally I'd be able to find success with that strategy if I was doing it well, whatever well means in this context. But the roundabout question here is generally, what do you make of difficulty in most games, and any notable examples that were either positive, surprisingly so, negative, predictably so, maybe, and things that, like, it sounds like you guys decided this, the whole gold thing. You said you decided this before development had even really kicked off for NPlusPlus. Like, this was an explicit directive. So maybe this is stuff that, like, you're encountering these games that have this more fake difficulty, this less satisfying difficulty, after you've already created NPlusPlus and made that decision. Is there anything that then reaffirmed it? Like, oh yeah, I mean, not necessarily to toot your own horn, but this game is, like, the way that we handle it in our game is way better than the way that they handle it in this game. Anything come to mind about that? Because I'm interested in starting a conversation specifically about that. Like, I think more game developers and more people who are playing games, they need to maybe have a little bit more, piss and vinegar when a game is literally just increasing the math. You know what I'm saying?
It's there's so much that this is very interesting. I mean, just as a brief aside, the thing about the gold is, I mean, and it's something that you can see, it's like shows up holographically in the game itself, is we're perfectionists. So the gold was specifically because looking at N and N plus levels, we realize this gold is just arbitrary and it's not being used in a way that adds enough. It's too haphazard. It didn't have enough thought. But so it wasn't really done with the thought of, like, any other game coming to mind. But about that, I think that it's a question of, it's like, I think it gets to the core of something about game design, which I don't know enough about, and I feel like no one understands game design enough about yet. But where it's like you're saying, if you select a hard difficulty, it's because you're bored of the game, or you want more of a challenge. You'd like the game to change qualitatively, but often it just changes quantitatively by making the numbers go up. And I think a lot of the problem is, I mean, ultimately, okay, everything in a computer is numbers, but there are a lot of games that are very much numbery numbers, like RPGs, stats, any kind of combat system, right, generally is just the play of numbers bouncing around and interacting. So it's super easy to, okay, just increase the numbers, have the numbers, whatever. Much more difficult is other kinds of hooks that introduce constraints, change the flow or the rules. Like, I can't think of great examples off the top of my head. I'll try to in a sec. But, like, I think that's the difficulty, is that, I mean, it gets back to the combat system. Like, so many games are the same game, right? It's like, and I mean, it's like, I made a platformer, or you helped make a platformer. It's not like, it's the same. It's like, it's okay to have genres and riff in the genres, but I feel very frustrated that at the end of the day, like, number-based combat system is like 50% of games, and there's just very little that's being done of interest in it. Like, no one's taking it in a cool direction, really. I just want to plug Cinco Paus by Michael Bro, CINCO space PAUS. It's a puzzle / strategy game that I think is just the best. It's honestly, I think, the best example of game design, rich game design, where there's a small handful of mechanics, but they all interact with each other, like, literally, I don't know, n factorial, whatever it is. Like, every possible thing can influence every other possible thing in such a rich way that it makes the game feel magical, which is good because it's a game about arcane magic and stuff like that. But anyways, getting back to this whole difficulty thing, I really like, I mean, I think that the rise of accessibility options like in Celeste and Disc Room is super cool, because it lets you, essentially, it lets you tune the game so that you can have fun with it, because people are all different physiologically and mentally, and it's cool to have software kind of recognize that. I'm trying to think of, like, a difficulty. I mean, okay, here's another great example. Doom the Roguelike. I don't know if you've heard of it. really, I think probably my favorite traditional rogue. Like it's an actual roguelike from before Spelunky came out, and then any game with they called the random function was called a roguelike. Doom the roguelike, an actual roguelike, ASCII art, it's on a grid, etc. One thing I love about it is its approach to difficulty. Okay, yes, it's a menu driven thing, but it essentially provides a set of challenge modes so that once you've beaten the game normally, it poses you all kinds of problems. Like, okay, beat the game with only melee weapons. And I mean, it's Doom, so 90% of the weapons are ranged weapons. I mean, it's based on Doom. It's like there's a lot more in it than just the name might say. It's essentially a mashup of like Quake and Doom and all kinds of sci-fi. It's everyone check out Doom the Roguelike. Fantastic game. Anyways, the challenge modes are great. So it's like there's the melee only run, a run where you only have a set number of moves per floor. Like just essentially, he's gone through the engine, the mechanical simulation, and identified all these different aspects. Oh, what if you have half the inventory? Now that is a number that's just being halved, but the effect it has on your gameplay is it's I don't know if non-linear is the right term, but it's certainly not just a quantitative. Like you have to play very differently because Doom the Roguelike is ultimately about resource management. So your inventory slots are where all of the most important strategic decisions in the game take place. So I don't know. I think challenge modes like that is a super fun idea. I mean, hidden, Super Mario World and plus style, there's secret content hidden. Actually, Hyper Light Drifter, another amazing game that does the secret thing so well, which is essentially all of the hardest combat encounters are hidden. And you will not experience them by beating the game. But if you poke around, like, Hyper Light Drifter is, I just love how the secrets work in that game. And it's all based on, in an isometric view, there's a lot of ambiguity about can I go behind there? Is that a barrier or can I walk there? And what they did is they answered this like what's normally frustrating because you think you can walk around but you can't, or whatever. They just hidden little one-off random encounters and alternate paths through the world in all of these ambiguous places. So that if you do go and explore every nook and cranny, there's always something there. It's sometimes not so easy to find and figure out how to trigger, but it's always there. But if you don't feel like you're missing anything. But anyways, the fact that the hardest combat takes place purely in these optional side questy rooms, I think it's just so smart because, again, like for people playing it a second time or for people who are just really into it, it's a way of layering stuff on that just feels natural and it doesn't interrupt playing the game. And it's elegant, like there's something beautiful about when you can make the existing system accommodate more affordances, like without adding, you don't have to add anything. You just maybe make some connections between things that are already there and then something new emerges. I think it's super cool.
As long as we're talking about difficulty, I wanted to get your take on something that I know for developers particularly is incredibly difficult. So that is updating your game after it's done and then deciding somehow, oh yeah, now it's really, really done. So with NPlusPlus in particular, game releases, but that's really only the beginning. And I kind of see a parallel between the whole easy to complete or easy to start, but really difficult to full clear. It wasn't exactly easy, I'm sure, to actually ship the game, but maybe it was even more hard in some elements to decide, okay, we're finally finished. So can you walk us through like the process of you guys deciding, no, this is done and we're definitely not coming back? Like, first of all, is that even decided? And second of all, like how confident are you that they're like, all right, we're definitely not releasing, like working on like a hidden extra map pack somewhere down the line. We're definitely not going to keep working on this. Like it's totally taken care of. And, just some thoughts on reaching the decision to say we're moving on from the end platformer line.
It's hard. I mean, okay, so there's a few things going on here about the whole end thing. I mean, we're definitely not going to make another sequel. We would like to release if we can. Like the one thing that got cut that I wish we hadn't had to cut was online multiplayer. Now that there's Parsec and Steam Remote Play, it's not so bad. But we're definitely hoping that there's a chance in the future to release N++ and add online multiplayer. About more levels, we don't have any plans. One of the foundational things when we decided to make N++ was we knew we could do a lot better than N+, and we also knew we were like we have a real mental block about this series, which you might be able to tell, because it's like we prototyped half a dozen games in the years between we've been working on them, but nothing has been as fun for us to play as N was. And that's, for us, that's like a real barrier to get excited about it, to take it from a prototype to start production. So, and part of it was we felt like there was this unfinished business of like when we made N Plus, we had 9 months, we had no budget, we were still learning. We knew we could do it a lot better, and we wanted to just kind of like leave it all out in the field. And we feel like we did accomplish that. However, you're right that it wasn't straightforward. And we released N++ initially, and then a couple years later, we released an Ultimate update, which like doubled the size of the game and made it significantly harder, because the stuff we added, honestly, it was after seeing some people 100% the original version, we realized we hadn't made it hard enough for the 10-year veterans of the series. So we added a lot of the secret challenges in the Ultimate levels were that, but it's also just like a byproduct of the development was very rocky, and like I don't really want to get into it too much, but basically the game wasn't planned at being 4,000 levels. It was planned at like 1,000 or something like that. But essentially, programming was a bottleneck, and so we had to keep delaying shipping the game. And when you're a designer and you're just waiting for the programming to be done, and I think in hindsight, okay, also as a way to feel better, to distract yourself from the stress of the situation you're in, you just start making levels, and you make more levels, and you iterate on the levels you have to polish them more and to fool around. So by the time we launched N++, we had like twice as many levels as we had planned. However, we didn't have time to make them all as good. So I'd say about half of the Ultimate levels that were released 2 years later actually existed at launch. We just didn't have the hours poured into them to polish them to get them good enough to be in the game. And also, we felt like the game had enough levels. So, and so then, like, we didn't anticipate for the Steam version and for all the ports to be like years separated. But it was just like, it's hard to, like, our original programmer quit. It was hard to find another programmer. And so the technical end kind of held us up, but that gave us more time to, like, what was initially just a map pack, we realized, okay, we can add in a bunch of stuff that was cut, the headbands, which I wish we had put in for launch, like a bunch of things that that were cut, we could put back in, and we had time to finish those levels and to make a bunch of new ones. Most of the multiplayer levels are new, like were made after the launch of the original version. So, I mean, you're totally right that like the development process mirrors the game in a lot of ways. And as an artist or as someone creative, it's hard to know when to be done. And especially with software, if that's your medium, it's even harder because you can change it after you've released it. You can, it's like, and in fact, since N++ has launched and we've been watching people play streams, I have a file of whenever we notice, like there's different cheesy strategies and ways of kind of breaking the levels, and a lot of those are fun and we're going to keep, but we've noticed a few that we don't like that we might patch out if we do get to launch on a new platform, say. And just stuff was like, yeah, we've been taking notes about ways of tweaking the levels, and we realize, okay, this is the perfectionism, like, God, just leave it. But at the same time, like, if we are going to put the time into doing a multiplayer version, or somehow just put all the production effort into it, which we hate and which we don't find rewarding, we do love design and creating stuff, and so we feel like it would be a wasted effort to have the opportunity to do another round of polish and to tweak things. So it's like, but anyways, we don't have any plans. We are working on a bunch of new stuff now, so we definitely have moved on, because the whole point was to get N++ out of our blood, and it is, from a development point of view, but something that we didn't anticipate when we launched that's been amazing since it's just the rise of Twitch. Like when we made N+, 3 years after we made N+, we saw a YouTube video of some people playing co-op, and we were like, this is amazing, this is so great. But like now, when we launched the Ultimate Edition, I actually watched. There's a streamer called Zella. He got all the gold in all of the new content in literally 24 hours, and he streamed the whole thing, and a bunch of people were watching it. It was really awesome. I mean, it did make me feel a bit bad because I was like, we clearly didn't make this hard enough. But I mean, on the plus side, the challenges were hard enough, and that took him a lot longer, so I feel okay. But yeah, it was just the feedback of watching people play on Twitch, especially the multiplayer modes, has been so inspirational and has definitely changed our goals in terms of the future projects that we're working on. In the N++ was not designed to be spectated, and unless you're familiar with the game, it can be boring to watch because you do not appreciate just how much skill is involved in moving. I think in a large part because in the past 20 years, momentumless platforming has become so popular that it's very hard to appreciate for your random Twitch viewer what's going on behind the scenes. But anyways, I just want to say, like, yeah, Twitch has been amazing. It's so gratifying. Like, honestly, the only reason we kept working on the original web game was because we got emails from people who played it saying that they loved it and like, here's a suggestion for a feature, or are we going to make more levels, or like basically that's the only reason that over a few years we released new updates to the free version, and that spawned a community of map makers, and it spawned this snowball thing, and it was purely just because of the positive feedback that, because we're like, I guess we're both a bit introverted, and we're creative people, so maybe we're a bit sensitive, I don't know, and it's just tremendously rewarding to feel like, to me, it feels like I'm not crazy. That's what it like, the feeling of, because when you put something out, when you think something is good, you don't know, am I just, we're in this bubble, am I deluded? And so seeing people connect with the game and enjoy it and like just have a good time with it has been tremendously, like, it's kind of kept N++ going in our minds just as an inspiration for like what we want to lean into in the future. In terms of like stuff that's more spectator friendly, stuff that's multiplayer, ideally. Maybe like our prototypes are going to be local only, but I don't know, we'll see. But yeah, just, I don't know. At this point, I've forgotten what the question actually was. I actually, no, I do remember the kind of like the never ending development cycle. And I mean, N++ is definitely less dead than I thought it would be. Like, oh god, at this point it's like 5 years ago when we released the Ultimate Edition. Like, it's absurd and surreal how that's happened, and I'm really happy. And like, we just have the best community. Like, honestly, like, we have this whole Discord community that just happened. Like, we didn't even know about it. But one of, like, there's just a fan, Danny Danman. Shout out to Danny Danman, who set up our Reddit page. We weren't even on Reddit. And like, he just set it up and emailed us, hey guys, here you go. And then similarly set up the Discord. And it's like, and actually we got to meet him in 2018. He's from the Netherlands, and we were in Milan. And so he came down and we like hung out all day, and it was just super awesome. Like, that was a super fun experience. But yeah, again, I guess where I was going with this was like, we're not doing N+++, but actually, sorry, this is another thing. A community member called Big Blarg ran an in-person race mode tournament called NP++, basically Pacific Northwest N++ tournament, with 8 people, came over to his house and spent the weekend. And he was having people from the community make levels because he wanted all new levels. Because like, a large part of the skill in N is reading the level. It's not about memorizing, it's about learning on the fly. So he wanted new levels, and the community was making new levels, but it kind of became apparent that they weren't going to make enough. And also, I was just inspired. So we actually spent a month making like 100 new race mode levels just for this tournament, which was super fun. It was like a super awesome thing. So we are open to like, I gotta stop. This answer is just such a run-on sentence, but like, essentially the only, like, one of the big reasons why we even made N++ was every time we make one of these games, we get super burnt out because like making the levels is like songwriting or painting, right? Where it's this fun creative process, but then when you have to do it for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, you need to take some years off. But then essentially like around 2011, 2012, we found ourselves making levels for fun again. And then we realized, oh wait, like there's all this unexplored potential. Like we knew there was way more juice left to be like squeezed out of what was implicit in the original design. So like basically making the levels, the enjoyment of the process of being creative in that field was another reason, like another force propelling us to iterate yet again, I guess.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that whole community integration must be huge. As somebody who follows a lot of competitive gaming, when I see, Jagunda tournaments going on where there's like arenas and it looks like it's something out of a sporting event or maybe like a Broadway play or something that you got these like 40,000 people asses in seats, sold out stuff. That's crazy to think about that's actually happening in gaming. And I feel like maybe people who are hardcore esports viewers will probably have been desensitized to. But if you really think about how many people that is, and that's just the people who are on site, forget about the maybe hundreds of thousands of people watching online at any given time, like it can be pretty overwhelming to see that many numbers. And, right now that's mostly centered around mainstream games, right? Games that have a large backing, but that could totally change and be something more homegrown, depending on the kind of game that comes out. Obviously, it's a bit different for what you guys have put together and what you guys sound like you're building at this stage. But just the idea of having any element of that, any fragment of that, having be like just some Twitch streamer, right? He's firing up your game and he's going through it, and he's making you sweat a little bit. Like, did we make it hard enough? It doesn't look like it. Maybe we have to go back to the drawing board. That is some of the sort of joys of the whole creative process. The payoff, really. Like maybe you're in the moment of like, all right, I released the game, time to veg out and just relax. Oh, but there's somebody playing it on Twitch. Let me watch, and then you get sucked right back into it. You're like, yeah, I got to take notes. He's cheesed it. So it sounds like a lot of that was going on, and that's actually really gratifying from a creative person point of view. So if I can ask you a bit of the inverse of that, were there moments of maybe external, like the opposite of external validation, where like maybe criticism came in that cut really deep, or was something where that made you guys second guess it? Or like basically the question is, like, was it all sunshine and rainbows, or was there points of interacting with an external community that didn't have a full appreciation of all of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into the development, or didn't fully understand the elements? I've heard people complain about the lack of online multiplayer, for example. Were there ever any outcries that actually really made you guys second guess yourselves, or think a little bit, a second look over some of the elements that you guys had put together, or was it mostly fine? What do you say to that?
There wasn't really anything too negative. I mean, I think like definitely like Steam reviews and comments can get negative, and since it's like literally our job, we have to engage with it, which is not a dynamic I love. But at the same time, there have been instances of someone complains about something, I explain the rationale behind the decisions we made, and they're like, okay, you know what? I'll give it a second chance and stuff. So like it's not purely negative. And honestly, we made the game kind of in a vacuum, and there wasn't a lot of external playtesting. And and it is a very niche thing, and it's a very weird thing. Like, there's definitely one big streamer I remember who played it, and in so many words said it was a Super Meat Boy ripoff, which is the chronology is actually reversed. Like, for instance, like elements like the quick retries or even the rocket enemy. Like, that's actually what he was talking about. He's like, oh, it has rockets just like in Meat Boy. I was like, no, actually, Meat Boy has rockets like an N. But anyways, like, I mean, the thing is, like, it's hard to stay mad at that. Like, I mean, it's that definitely, like, you're right. It does. It's hard to, like, especially for us. So much of our personal identity is wrapped up in this thing, and we don't view it as like a product. We don't have a distance to it like a big company might. So yeah, it can hurt, but at the same time, like, I think one thing we've learned making this series is it's not for everyone. It's super niche. The way that the movement mechanics work, like, it's literally floaty, which is the adjective that everyone uses to describe a bad game. So it's kind of like it already isn't for everyone. But I think one thing, and it's something that I think something we take a lot of solace in is the stuff that we like generally is stuff that's not for everyone. And we would rather have what we do have. And I'm so happy that it's worked out this way, which is like the people that like it really love it because it's so specific and it's so different from everything else that just makes it more precious and more, interesting to them. And so it's like the double-edged sword of like, I would love it if it was more mainstream. I would love it if like race mode was at Evo. But at the same time, like, I mean, it's such a niche thing. Like it's like niche upon niche. Like there's 2 or 3 or 4 layers of nicheness happening. So I think the fact that it has any community is amazing. The wonderful, positive, like non-toxic community, like that's one thing that I'm like the most proud of, I think, is on Discord, people show up and comment on how inviting our community is compared to other speedrunning or hard platformer game communities. And I just am super grateful. And it's honestly, I don't know, like part of it maybe is based on us because I know we've always been very open with our fans and we love communicating with them and interacting with them and being positive and welcoming to everyone. But I think it also is just the community, and we can't take a lot of credit for it. Just there are some really cool, nice people who've been around for a decade being part of the community and setting a good example for people and like making really cool maps and doing other cool stuff. So yeah, like so much of our company is owed to people doing stuff like Arachnid, Nick. Oh my god, I'm spacing on his last name. His handle's Arachnid, anyways. He made the Numa end user maps archive, where like for the web version you could make the maps in the game, but there was no way of sharing them. But it dumped out a string containing the level data. So he made awesome database where you could leave feedback, you could post your replay so other people could watch, you could rate things. It gave you a visual preview of what the level looked like by parsing the level data, which he was all reverse engineered. We didn't even know it was happening. And it like put it up and it helped make map making much more of a viable and thing. Like people are still making end maps. And stuff like that where it's just like, I don't know. I just feel super grateful that we managed to inspire and connect with so many people, and it was the kind of a feedback loop of that. I don't know. Nick Johnson, that's it.
Nick Johnson, shout out Nick Johnson. So you mentioned that it's a niche, almost like a niche within a niche, and you're grateful for the community that you have, and you're acknowledging that it didn't have to happen that way. Like it's not inevitable that a game like N or any of its sequels spawned the community that it did and is in the position that it's in now. This is a general question. It's totally like not even necessarily related to gaming specifically. I think it could be any product, any media. Don't you think that's actually what happens to everything? Is that you start off with niche success and then somebody will give you the big break opportunity. You see this with like, this is not a one-to-one comparison at all, but some director of a hit indie film will get signed on for Spider-Man 67 or something. You know what I mean? Like they get signed on for a bigger break and then super constrained with what they can do with the material, which leads to a product that feels like it wasn't actually directed by the same guy. Maybe a lot of his own voice doesn't shine through exactly. We see this happen a lot in that realm. I feel like that probably is also something that's happened to games in the past. What are your thoughts on like the dangers of trying to appeal to a mainstream audience by sanding off the rough edges? Was that a concern in your line of work? Was that a concern with your games? I've heard that, for example, you would go to some of these, I don't remember if it was GDC or some other venue, but you would actually demo the game in between sort of development, and people would always have a really hard time with like the early levels, for example, and then you'd refine and reduce the element, right? And I'm not necessarily against that in theory, but it does remind me of actually the same process that will sometimes happen where a niche hit will then be attempted in a failed attempt usually to catapult it into a mainstream success, but it's still too niche and weird for mainstream appeal, but also lost a lot of what made it enticing to its niche audience. So do you have any thoughts on that subject in general?
The uncanny valley of nicheness.
Yeah.
I actually think I know the anecdote you mean about the levels. I mean, in that case, what it was We had never demoed the game. We took it to Bit Summit in Kyoto, and it's like essentially one of the levels that we ended up putting near the end of the game was right near the beginning, and things like that where it's like we always make errors that way. And in N plus there was a notorious level that happened like 2/3 through that a lot of people couldn't make it past, and in N plus plus there was one level where we made a mistake like that, but it's just like that wasn't like it wasn't so much trying to sand off the rough edges. It's just like recognizing, okay, we need to reorder things because the difficulty curve is not what we had anticipated. But I mean, in general, I think a lot of it must be some kind of bias of like because the successful things, like of necessity, there's been a chain of happy accidents because in all cases where that didn't happen, it wasn't a success at the end and those branches got pruned. So the only paths you ever see are the lucky ones or something like I like
survivorship bias, basically, but for game development.
Sorry, yes, that there it is. I mean, I don't know. Like I think the thing is, I would like to feel like everything is like that, but I vividly remember, I think GDC 2008 maybe or 2009, where Capcom, I think it was Lost Planet. It's like a game on an ice world. I forget, third person. Where this is like I was so naive because like we didn't know anything about the games industry. We were just completely on our own before. And in a postmortem for the game, they explained that the marketing budget was 50-50. Like it was, they spent as much on marketing as on development. And so to me, as an indie, I'm like, okay, so you could have made two games, but instead you made a game and then you burnt a pile of money because of this horribly inefficient system that we're operating in. And I don't know. So I feel like personally, it would be nice if everything that is currently popular became that way as part of a grassroots movement. And certainly there are great examples. Like I think Rocket League is super inspiring of like people who loved their idea. And even though it didn't connect the first time around, they knew they had magic there and they kept iterating on it until it did, until like the time and place were right. Or even like Dota, like, or basically like any game that started as a mod is a great example of that kind of thing. But I think for every Dota, there's a League of Legends. For every, for every thing that is great and that became successful as a positive feedback loop of people connecting with it, there are countless, especially now that, in-app purchases and like the whole, like the games business has kind of morphed into these like money harvesting algorithm machines. Like I think and the marketing aspect is just got like marketing is a whole thing that I just have such a whole like it's something that's always just felt so like absurd and such like it's like a travesty, right? It's because like literally you could have multiple great games, but instead, or like even just pay like developers could be paid to make twice as much work as they are making, but instead that money has to go on ads or like free energy drinks at conferences, like whatever. It's like I want more art. I want more good stuff. I want more stuff being made. I don't like the friction, the penalty of marketing is just and the way that it scales with like the way that basically small teams like us are the cockroaches where we can't compete, we can't market, we don't have millions of dollars. So like I mean we market, but we can't directly compete in the way that like big companies can flood you. You can, TV ads or whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a non-linear kind of, I don't know, power law. There's some kind of feedback. I don't know what the right term to describe the dynamic is, but it's certainly like people like entities that have hundreds of millions of dollars are probably the least interesting, least creative entities I can think of, because that there has to be their nature because of how they operate. But they're able to kind of flood the zone and control things. And all the interesting work happens on the margins, which is like, is that inherent in capitalism? Is that inherent in scale and communication networks? Even like removed from capitalism, is it a function of how information gets around? And like, I don't know. I don't know any of these things, but it's frustrating. It's frustrating to see that it's viable to make a game where, if you spend X million, just pouring X million into this funnel, you get X plus 1 million coming in. And so you just keep doing that. And it's not making anything better. It's, in fact, making people's lives worse, because the metrics they're using to optimize this are they take advantage of people's mental weakness and stuff like that. So it's like, again, I feel like every one of these questions has gone way off the rails, and I'm just endlessly ranting. But I think it's awesome when grassroots, when little stuff blows up big. Like, I feel like seeing Celeste be massively popular, as someone who's been a fan of Maddie's work since, in fact, like, I remember playing Jumper when it came out, which is like almost exactly to the month the same time that the original N came out, and playing all these, like, all her platformers, and seeing that, and then like Towerfall got pretty popular. Like, that's actually a game I've seen people do tournaments in a huge game bar in Seattle. There's a tournament on a screen. That was a super awesome event. I think it's awesome. It's so cool. Like, indie games, I haven't followed indie music for like a couple decades, but so I suspect this is the case everywhere. But especially, there's something about games and digital distribution that just fits so perfectly. Seeing like the rise of itch.io, and seeing like this, like, just talented people find their audience, I think has been super inspiring. I think Braid's a good example of that too. Like, just something, or Portal with Narbacular Drop was like the student game that became Portal. This is just like, it's awesome when like the little, when the campfire turns into a wildfire in a good way, then that's kind of an awesome phenomenon to experience. And I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I totally agree. The question that I always have in the back of my head is like, how is there a particular, like a literal, like, law of nature or reality that dictates when, or like what the preconditions are for something that is niche but explodes in popularity, or little, like you say, like the campfire into a wildfire, but like when it stops being the campfire in its soul, you know what I mean? Like when it starts to change, and not necessarily for the better or even for the worse, but just change in a way where it stops being recognizable. Like, are there things that you can point to that say like, okay, if this is true, then that's the output? It's always interesting to me. You were talking earlier about like laws of power and stuff. Are you familiar with the Pareto distribution?
I've heard of it. I know it like relates to the expected, like some kind of expected distribution following a power curve.
Yeah. Essentially, like the top, like 90% of the work in a company is done by the top 10% performing employees, or something to that effect, right? So this applies to games, but I think in a way that many people have not necessarily considered, because it's true for like trees, the heights of trees in a forest. It's not necessarily a human phenomenon, but I think the way it's true in games is like 10% of the games draw 90% of the audience. And a lot of people equate that to 10% of games are better than 90% of other games. Like, if you want to measure quality, if you were able to somehow quantify that objectively. But that's not the same thing, because the games that are 10% of games being better than 90% of the other games are not the same games that are getting 90% of the audience, right? So you have like two different curves, and there's not as much overlap as you would think, because some of the best games are not popular, and some of the most popular games are not good. And so I think that's an interesting distinction to riff off of too, if you were interested. The other thing that you brought up that I thought was kind of neat is you were talking about how they put, the marketing budgets are 50-50, 1-to-1. This happens in films a lot too, I hear. And so I'm kind of interested. There's an anecdote from, I'm a big RTS guy, and StarCraft 2 came out, and I thought it was one of the worst games ever. And in StarCraft 2, there is essentially like, there's like a behind the scenes clip somewhere. I'll try to remember to link it if I can find it, where the developers are basically saying, yeah, we plugged in the amount of resources worth of units on the map into a spreadsheet to determine how long the player would have to play the map in order to win, which is essentially the tantamount to admitting that you were designing for grind for expected playtime and not for like okay, well, if they do this, they can it's sort of, if you were to compare it to NPlusPlus, it's like, all right, well, here's all the coins and like, yeah, here's all the elements on the map, but obviously you can just speedrun it. And in this sort of cynical, like almost marketer driven, like just dripping with like malice and contempt for the player, in my opinion, like all of this, I'm ascribing to it way worse, like actual reasons than it probably was. I think it was probably just some naive or ignorant developers, but it's the end result is like dripping with this, like, yeah, you're just here to be led like you use the analogy like a farm animal being led to the trough, almost like you're just here to play the game for this amount of time, and we need time so that you can feel like your experience was worth the money or something. I don't really know what it was. So
yeah, I do, like, I definitely remember a quote that Ron Carmel told me, which is like, never, I forget who actually said it, but like, never attribute to malice what can be explained as ignorance. Which I definitely think, like, I mean, so there are so many paths that what you described can happen, where something that had this magic loses the magic, right? Like, okay, there's obviously, if the people involved, the creative people involved change, that's a thing. But I think a lot, like in the case of StarCraft 2, there's a certain, like, I feel like, I mean, this is something I don't have a ton of firsthand experience in, but we do know a lot of people at AAA, and it just seems like it's a function of, in a big team, you just can't operate. Like, we always like the analogy of a band in terms of indie games. That's what the creative process is like, and you can riff off each other. Everyone kind of knows what's involved in everyone else's stuff, and whereas once you scale to a certain size, you can't operate that way, and then maybe you need to rely on a metric, right? You need to be able to boil things down into a number, so, like, to get to your spreadsheet thing, where it's like, well, if you don't have, like, like Lennon McCartney that can say, no, don't use that chord, use this chord. If you don't have like an authority like that, because it's a big team and you're trying to share responsibility of, like, whatever the reason, you need to make it a number. And once you have a number, well, the number is just, it's supposed to be a heuristic that guides you to a goal. Like with money, like, it's actually the same thing as what you're talking about, where the popular games aren't necessarily the good games, right? Where it's like, if you only have one way of measuring things, then that's what you're going to measure. And so, like, they probably, whoever came up with that heuristic, the spreadsheet, like, it should take this, like, it probably did come from a good place, or they just needed some kind of some way of sorting or ranking things, or knowing, does this level need to be worked on more? Is this level good? Right now, if you're writing a song, you can answer, is the song good? Because you're the one you're answering to, and you're responsible for what you're making. But in that context, you can't just say it's good because I said it's good, because your boss or your boss's boss is going to be like, no one liked this level, so you're fired. It's like, okay. But so, yeah, like, I don't know. It's like, it's really hard to describe. Sorry, the immediate example, just going back to the niche thing that kind of lost its edge, is the thing that popped into my mind is Wu-Tang Clan. Because, and which I have always been utterly fascinated by, because my theory, because, like, I feel like, and I think a lot of fans, like, I'm not super a hardcore fan, but, like, the consensus is essentially the music kind of started sucking, and a lot of the dynamics around that are based on the economics of sampling, and it suddenly just became prohibitive to sample 8 songs in your song, and instead there's live orchestration, and there's synthesizers, and there's stuff that changes the collage aspect of the aesthetic, right? And then there's also, like, RZA, the producer of the beats. Like, you can tell from interviews, like, he's obviously a super smart guy. He's amazing. And his music is amazing, but you could tell he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder from, like, quote unquote real musicians, because he was self-taught. He was using a sampler. He didn't know how to read sheet music. And in so many interviews, when you watch over the years, he's like, now I can read sheet music. Now he can play like 8 instruments now. But I feel like his music got worse the better he got at all these things, because what made it good was the rawness. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, the magic can be lost unintentionally through the best of, and something, that we were cognizant of. In fact, there's a level in NPlusPlus called Once Loved Accidental Masterpiece. That's a quote from a Penny Arcade comic, which, like, I don't know, I've mixed feelings now, but 10 or 20 years ago or whatever, I guess 10 years ago, we were reading Penny Arcade, and they use it in reference to Star Wars and what happened with that. And it's something we were cognizant of. It's like, we don't want to pull a George Lucas and ruin this thing that we accidentally magically created. Like, we didn't intend for it to be as fun as it was. We just were making something, and then the fun happened, and we kind of followed it. And we didn't want to lose the magic. And so anyway, sorry, it's something like the George Lucas / Rizification of things, where you like, and that's actually like, it's something that we've experienced ourselves, because the first thing we started when we shipped N+ was a project called Robotology, where we wrote our own physics engine, like essentially Box 2D, but using a different simulation paradigm that now is gaining popularity in academia, but at the time was like a super niche thing, which has interesting trade-offs. Like, we were interested in it because like, we're interested in simulation and movement as an element of interactive, like of games or interactive environments, but also because the trade-offs of Box 2D, the trade-offs of an impulse-based simulation, are very interesting in that it's like optimized for making loose stacks of rigid shapes, but it's terrible at motorized, driven, articulated shapes. Like, we were trying to make robots that walked, and we realized, okay, Box 2D isn't going to cut it, and this other stuff, actually, like, there's a whole different way, position-based dynamics, that is the diametric opposite. Stacks have, like, collision becomes harder, stacks of loose stuff are not as good, but you can make like a mobile that's like a link, like nested 8 levels of things hanging off things, and pull on it, and super stable in a way that joints just aren't stable with impulse-based stuff. And sorry, God, I went on a tangent on the tangent. The point is, we finished N+, we started Robotology, we burned ourselves out. We spent like 2 years just doing essentially tech. And because, like, as an overcompensation, because what we failed to realize was the magic of N was purely because we had years of little trinkets lying around. Oh, a tile collision system. Oh, a ragdoll. And then once we had all these pieces that worked, we sat down and figured out a project where we could slot them in. Robotology was like, I guess it's basically bottom up versus top down. Robotology was top down. We had this grand game design that, of course, like, as it's like the classic sophomore system syndrome, where you put in everything that you couldn't put in the first time. But turns out not putting things in is as important or more important than putting things in. So it's like the same phenomenon of, like, we overcompensated. We lost the magic. We really lost the magic in terms of the fun of game development, just in terms of like everything. And so since then, we've definitely course corrected, and we've realized, okay, that just what works for us as a creative process is not top down. We're never, like, we're not great programmers and we're not great designers. So if you give us a target and say hit that target, we're never ever going to hit it. But what we are good at is, I think, just creative and lateral thinking, and we both just are really into a bunch of things, and we love exploring the possibilities. So we just have a lot better time when there's not a fixed goal. There's a direction, an initial direction we're going to head in, but then we just kind of go with it. Just like when you're making music, like, oh, I didn't mean to, like, I accidentally turned on this effect instead of that effect, but it sounds better than what I wanted to do. It's like, I think that that kind of happy accident in your development process is important. And the more bottom up you are, the more you're enabling that kind of stuff to emerge. Or you're even just not killing the happy little sparks. You're letting the sparks kind of find some kindling and turn into a fire. Whereas it's really easy to stifle yourself because you have this vision, you have this dream that you must create. And I mean, some people do work great that way, but just personally for us, we found like there's definitely I don't know if it's less is more, but essentially, I mean, it's just, whatever. We discovered through years of painful error that humans work in weird ways. So sometimes not having a fixed goal is the best way to, like, reach a goal somehow. I don't know.
Well, the other thing too is you were saying, is it less is more? Is it having limitations breeds excellence in some way. That was a quote when I was talking with Jonathan Below, that I threw at him and said, like, what do you think of this? So it kind of, I'm seeing echoes of that in this conversation. But the other thing too is that, like, it might not even be either of those. It might just be that knowing a focus and then not allowing that focus to shift too much. Like, you widen the hole to peer through, like, the keyhole or something. I don't know where this analogy is, but you do that so that you can figure out, like, what you're really looking at. If you go too far, or if you angle it just right, then you're going to lose what you were originally seeing. And maybe that's actually a good thing, like you said with the song, or like the example of like a certain effect on the pedal or whatever. That's obviously going to change things, and maybe it'll be like, oh, we can go down this direction. But at some point, you diverge meaningfully and maybe irrevocably from the original vision. This is something that I have a personal, like, I don't know if it's entirely that I just take umbrage with the idea. But it's definitely something that I'll say I'm on the fence about. I have maybe a love-hate relationship with, is the idea of wanting that change of pace within a game. And this comes from a very unlikely source, because back before I started really working on my own games, was mostly modding the original StarCraft and trying to create single-player stories, cooperative experiences, player versus player content. Basically, any element that you could engage with an RTS, I was trying to create content for that purpose. And one of the things that kept coming up is something that the original content was actually guilty of, was throwing at you these missions that stripped away all of the game mechanics that you were normally used to using, and then said, here, take this very small scale experience where you're just controlling a couple dudes instead of a whole base and army, and, like, path around until you win the mission, right?
The commando mission in Command and Conquer.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is stuff that's been in multiple games. It's like almost a staple of the RTS, and yet I never thought it was actually a good fit, and could never, like, from a game design perspective, strip back from any sort of personal discontent I might have for the idea. Just from a designer brain, I could never justify it, because it was a change of pace, but it was it's such a change that it really changed the kind of game you were experiencing. It's switching genres entirely in the same, basically, like, in the same breath. You might go from controlling a large army to a single person in very short order. And it's a fundamental change that you can't step back from, and you can't, like, rediscover the gameplay. Like, you're removing a lot of gameplay from the game, but not replacing it with anything. And even if you did successfully replace it, it's not like it's a different game now.
Right? Yeah, I totally, I know what you mean. It's like the whole design, and, like, for instance, like the UI, the game was made with a certain, like, actually, okay, I'm just going to use a different game as an analogy. Something I noticed with Dead Rising. Which, I don't know, it's like a game about fighting hordes of literally hundreds of zombies. And then they have these boss fights where it's one-on-one combat. But the problem is their combat system is designed for hordes, not for one-on-one, and it just doesn't work. The camera doesn't, like, nothing about it works. You can't, like, all of design is about trade-offs. You can't just have everything be the best, right? You have to balance this for this. So it's like you were saying, like, in an RTS, if your UI is about selecting groups of things, if everything is about managing groups, and then suddenly you don't have groups, it's going to be awkward in ways. Like, it's not going to be perfect for what that is. I mean, at the same time, it's fun. It's like maybe a novelty thing, or it's like, it's like it's like the slow song on the album of bangers. Like, you need like, sometimes that contrast, that dynamic is nice, of, like, if you want to get loud, just get quiet first, and then, so, it's like, I could see from a pacing point of view, or, like, how it could be useful, but I totally know what you mean, where the idea kind of outstrips the ability of the game to deliver on it, because the game was designed for something else that it wasn't doing. I wanted to loop back on constraints as a catalyst for creativity, which is, I, like, totally agree. I mean, it's like definitely, my analogy is always, like, give someone a pencil and paper and they'll sketch stuff. But if you just put them in an art store, they'll spend a year trying different. It's like they won't even pick a medium, let alone create anything, right? And definitely, it's something that with the level design, like, that's what end level design is about, really. Like, there's ultimately, like, there's like 24 things and, like, 8 shapes of geometry, and it's all about, like, that's all you have. Those are literally the only toys you have. How can you find, like, just endlessly recombining to find the new interesting dynamics that emerge, kind of like the interesting interactions between things. Like, I think that it would be easy to just write a bunch of one-off entities where it's like, I guess essentially set pieces. Like it's a different idiom of game design. I love the idea of a modular system because it's more like holistic. It makes the game more of a simulation where once the players internalize something, those are the rules, and it's stable. There's not a bunch of one-offs. It's just a modular system where everything just works, and it's limited, but it enables a lot of stuff too. I don't know. Like, I think that kind of gets. I mean, I'll just tie it to Robotology, one of our failed projects again. It had no grid. We were so sick of the tile grid. We came up with it was a gridless geometry, which caused all kinds of headaches for the editor. And we were doing like CSG, and it's all floats, right? Like we should have at least thought, okay, like it can be a grid, it'll just be a pixel grid or something, because the like numerical problems we never eliminated entirely. And then at the end of the day, we realized when we started making levels, like actually having a grid, having a modular system, as limited as it is very helpful, not just in terms of simplifying and streamlining the tools and the creativity, but from a user's point of view, it's like, yeah, I understand Mario can jump 3 blocks. It gives the player the tools to understand and read the scene immediately, where they don't have to do micro. Oh, is that 15 pixels or 16 pixels? I can't tell, right? If you have a grid, you can design around a grid. Not having a grid is like less constraints, but it ends up just making this huge, more of a soupy mess, and which we didn't appreciate at the time. But that's another thing we've learned the hard way.
Well, I mean, that's the only way out is through, I think, for a lot of, especially like self-taught people or people who are coming up without. I almost feel like it's pointless to even make a distinction between somebody who's not gone to college education, for example, for game design, and somebody who's just figured it out. Like, if anything, the person who doesn't go there might have a leg up, to be honest, from my personal experience anyway, because a lot of the things that you learn are maybe ancillary, or like they might be helpful, they might be useful, they might not be, you might have to just dismiss them, but a lot of the times, what you really learn is by doing stuff on the job as opposed to,
I get what you mean, because there's certainly there's a certain base level of stuff that is definitely helpful to learn in a structured way. But yeah, it's like beyond that, it's kind of like if you're learning how to play guitar, like, okay, there's certain things that like lessons and practice will help with, but if you're self-taught, it like you have been exploring it in your own way and you're developing your own style. Whereas if you were taught, you're already like your concept of what's possible or how to even view the problem is filtered through what they think, what their tastes are, or what their beliefs are. And I definitely think that there is a huge there's pros and cons for both, but I certainly think that developing your own relationship with how do you even conceive of certain kinds of problems, or how do it's like I think that can make a huge difference. And I think I agree. I mean, it depends. It really depends on the person ultimately, because I know amazing programmers who dropped out of high school and amazing programmers who did a master's. So it's kind of it's humans, I guess. We're crazy. We're very varied.
Humans. It is definitely humans. Speaking of humans, I actually wanted to talk to you a bit about team sizes, because this is something you said you had friends in AAA, and obviously you guys yourself are more of a smaller size team. Am I right to say that predominantly it was like a group of 2 to 3 people for most of your guys' history working on games?
Yeah. The original N was me and Mare, and we've been we do all the level design, we do the UI, we designed it all, but we're not tremendous programmers. So usually, we prototype NPlusPlus in Flash, because it was the last thing we did in Flash. We were super comfortable with it, and then team up with a programmer, a C++ programmer, to make a console version. That has been the model. Moving forward, just because the economics of how expensive the ports were for N++ and stuff, we definitely are now looking at we work in hacks, which is a lot more you can cross compile to a bunch of things. So but yeah, it was the 2 of us, and then we would team up with contractors to do programming, or in the case of N+, actually they did a lot of the art. We were just doing level design, and they did Like we essentially sent them like a style Bible, and then we did some iteration on the look. For NPlusPlus, we worked with a graphic designer, but we honestly could. I mean, it's a whole story. Like we started working with like one of our heroes. Like we're like they were our number two choice. Number one was the Designers Republic, who we knew we couldn't afford and we knew we couldn't work with because they're very much like, or their reputation anyways is like, here's what we've given you, that's it. And we needed someone who we could iterate with. But the people, and so we worked with these heroes of ours of graphic design, and they just turned out to be awful, awful to work with. And so we kind of blew half of our budget before we had anything. And so we intended for a graphic designer to do all the menus and stuff, but in the end, he could only do kind of like the logo and then a basic, like a template for what the menus could look like, where he didn't work out the UI or anything, but he just kind of gave us like a general visual style. Like he found the font, which was huge, because the font actually matched the game graphics in this fun way. It's all kind of like capsules. Not a lot, like there's no Beziers. It's all circular arcs or straight lines. And so like, yeah, we do work with like specialists and like people who have skills that where we don't feel as proficient, or like we know they're going to do a better job, or we don't have the time, or we just don't want to stomach it. But it is just the two of us, and we each kind of do everything. Mare is from a visual art background, so she definitely is more up on that, and I am like a musician, so I definitely do more of sound and music stuff. But it's I do think that there's like, it's just different things, right? It's like, do you want to be in a rock band or do you want to be in a symphony orchestra? The experience of those two things and the skill sets are totally different. And it's just at the end of the day, the kind of music that's produced as a result of what those two types of setups can produce is completely different too. And like, I am more into games where it's a small set of people. You can see the contributions of each person is very clear. I love that kind of like, I like recently, I forget what their team is called, but the people who made Minute and Disc Room, it's like I'm just I'm super into their stuff and their whole what they've got going on. Sock Pop is another awesome collective, 4 people. That's even more independent because it's like 4 people and they each do their own games, but they do kind of have a house style and they share code and stuff. I think, or like I know it. Like I think they've mentioned before, like, oh, this is based on that and stuff. And yeah, obviously Michael Bro, my like favorite game designer. I gotta plug Cinco Pals again. It's like literally the best game in my opinion that's ever been made from a game design point of view. The problem is it takes dozens of hours to even understand what's going on because of the nature of it. You can spoil it, and that's okay. And I would encourage you if you feel frustrated to do that. But like, it's just like it's a tour de force. It's ridiculous. It's absurdly advanced. Like it makes everyone else's games look like we don't know what we're doing in terms of the richness, in terms of the I can't get into it, but yeah.
Some people would say that if they come into contact with something that is so far beyond, like you said, it makes everybody else look foolish by comparison. If they come into contact with something like that, I know a decent number of people who would just wave the white flag then and there, right? So it sounds like more so that you've taken inspiration or maybe motivation, maybe not direct like I'm going to make a game like this, but more like this inspires me to be more productive, be better, be whatever insert X is, right? So can you speak a little bit to like things that have motivated you? I mean, you could talk more about Syncopause if you wanted to, but just in general, are there things, any sources of external like push that are like, all right, I'm on the right track. Like this is the field for me, like reaffirming the design decisions, the life choices, if you will.
I mean, I won't talk more about Syncopause because I could just go on forever about that. I do. Me personally, I'm more of a negative person, and I do think that a lot of when we made N, it was very explicitly a reaction, a pushback to things that we perceived going on, like casual games and things where we just felt like we're not into that. We don't like that direction, and I want to like blast back. You know, it was like a polemic kind of. So I think, and actually, that continues to be a source of inspiration in terms of when I'm playing a game and I hate something about it. I hate it so much. it makes me think like, why do I hate it? And analyze like, what could I have done different? Like the thing is, it's very easy to backseat design, and what you'll find is almost all the time, if you make the change you think is going to fix it, okay, it does fix it, but now you have two other problems that you didn't anticipate. Kind of like that's just in games, especially the knock-on effects are crazy like that. So, but having said that, I do think a lot of the motivation behind the ideas that we've explored, it's a good combination of like negativity where there's something we don't like and we want to fix it, or we want to give an example of like that's what we're like. I mean, I don't want to get yet another tangent, but we're currently exploring collision stuff, and just like because still to this day in 2021, the vast majority of 2D games are based on worlds that can only be squared. They're only based on squares. You gotta like, it's so boring and frustrating from the point of view of like, it's just so stifling and limited. But it turns out there are a lot of very interesting technical, like solving the collision problem, the depenetration problem in general, as Casey discovered on his streams, in which I had a great, like, I'm so glad that he ran up to that problem a couple times and he came up with solutions that I never conceived of that are really smart. Like his whole approach to search through space, I think is very interesting, and I want to explore it. Anyways, basically, so we're inspired by like what we see other people doing that we dislike or that we want to provide a counter argument to. Also, there's a healthy amount of like, this is great, I love this, and I'm so excited about this, I want more of it, or I want to run with it. So like, a lot of our ideas are definitely informed by Spelunky and also Doom the roguelike in terms of procedural generation, but also the way that levels and secrets and stuff work. And Single Pow's like, yeah, I don't think like we don't have any turn-based, grid-based games on the go now, but certainly the design, like there's something about that game where it's a game based on magic spells. I said I wouldn't talk about it anymore. Like, it's a game based on magic spells. The magic spells all follow the same format. There's a trigger condition, like the cause, and an effect. So the trigger condition might be when you hit a corner of the world, instead of ending when you hit the wall, turn 90 degrees and keep going. When you're zapping a little ray and it kind of traces its way through the world. So like, or there are some rays, like essentially what you realize when you're playing the game is literally anything that can happen in the game has a spell associated with it. There's no dead space. There's literally no empty dead space, which is so rare. Like every game has some wonky dead space where stuff doesn't really work or it doesn't make sense. But very methodically, it seems like he identified every possible type of event that could possibly happen and made something interesting and unique be the byproduct. And it just generates this synergistic cycle of cause and effect, triggering new causes, which trigger new effects. And the richness of it and the way it's so dense and there's no dead space just means that it's like, I don't know, it's just a really, that is an inspiration in terms of game design where it's like, I mean, Miyamoto has a great quote where like, a good solution solves at least two problems, right? Where it's like, that's what you want. You want that emergence. You want that synergy and that kind of multiplier, the exponential branching thing to happen. You definitely don't want a one in, one out because it's just dead and lifeless. So I definitely think that's an inspiration. I mean,
just to riff on that specific example, the Syncopause example of essentially having the gameplay, like every element justifies itself is what that sounds like to me, right? So there's nothing that like, maybe this can happen in this specific title, but something that I've always tried to like find a way to do it is like, if you see an element of the game, then you know that like, all right, that element will always be relevant, at least at the beginning, right? Like at least when you begin playing a level or something, like that is a relevant element of the game. And there are things you can do to interact with it, like be it a mechanic or just a specific entity on a map or something like that. And it's I agree that it's just the concept of that is inspirational in the sense that like it shows that it's possible to design a game where all of its components are relevant at least at the start, and maybe they continue to be relevant throughout, no matter what options the player decides to engage with, which is actually way harder, I think, is like making it so that if I don't care what strategy the player uses, like they should be able to use all of the elements at some
I'm
point.
telling you, you got to play this game. Like, so it's just as a random example, right? Yeah, there isn't an element in it that isn't interactive. So, for instance, when you kill enemies, they drop a little corpse. It just looks like 3 gray beans, right? Which initially you think, okay, it's just a bit of visual feedback. And it does, like, it makes the world richer. But a pet peeve of mine is that aspect in games where it's all window dressing. Like, that's another thing that we were pushing it back with End. We were like, you know what? No window dressing. Like, it's essentially just colored rectangle. Like, it's just stripped to the minimum. Anyways, I hate it because it's like it creates confusion because you think things are interactive when they're not. But it's also like all the time and effort spent making that gone into something that made the actual game more interesting and less just vapid set dressing. And that's a whole other. But anyways, about the corpse beans that get dropped. They're used, and they're not just used in one way. They're used in 2 completely different ways. One is there's a spell you can get where if an enemy's standing on a corpse and you hit it with this spell, it just kills them regardless. It's a super powerful thing. But it's hard to set up because it's like initially there are no corpses in each room. So you can only use it later on. And anyways, there's pros and cons. Like everything in the game, there's no unambiguous elements. Every spell has a benefit, but also a penalty or some kind of negativity to attach to it, which is just such smart design, right? Like otherwise the player, it's trivial. You know what to do and you just do it. Anyways, so the player has a spell, but the enemies get a spell too later. I'm spoilering things slightly, but one of the spells the enemies can develop is when they stand over a corpse, they consume it to heal themselves, which is crazy, and it changes everything. That can stop your poison effects, but can also just heal them in combat, which because it's a parity system, I don't know, I can't explain, but it's like it's just so brilliant because it's what would just be a nonsense little decal sprite that has no interactivity, instead gets fed back in, and it not only functions as that, as an aesthetic thing, making it feel like a rich game world, but it actually interacts and makes the world that much more alive. And it's like that game just oozes like richness. It oozes like, I mean, the audio visuals, like the visual style anyways, is definitely an acquired taste that I know a lot of people hate on and don't like, but I like difficult stuff that's not so easy to digest, but that rewards repeated listens. Essentially, it's like that's what I'm into. Because there's not that many great things in the world, and I love when I find something that gives me back as much as I can put into it. I don't know. I think game development is something like I'm still learning stuff. I'm learning stuff this year that like I thought I knew 20 years ago. And then it's like I knew on a superficial level, but it turns out there were some really important subtleties that like I didn't fully appreciate until just like, I don't know, it's nuts how that stuff works.
Another thing that you brought up when I first pitched you the question was that you were more inspired by failures of other products or things that frustrated you when you were playing them than necessarily being inspired by the successes. So I wanted to pick your brains about that too, because this is another similarity you and I have where a lot of what made me driven to create, for example, that RTS content that I was making before I made started working on my own games was exactly that. It was, I'm tired of playing like low grade offerings, both from the community, which sounds harsh because they're not being paid for it. But whatever, like if you want to really take the kid gloves off and do qualitative analysis, it's just not good. But also, I believe that I could do better. And not only that, I believe that I could do significantly better than even the people who were being paid to make the original content back in 1998 in this case. So super, super long time ago. But as audacious as it may sound, it isn't really that difficult when you break everything down. You use game designer brain to analyze how things worked. And I was inspired in many respects by the failures, right? Like I talked about the change of pace issue and how like, oh, they just changed the whole style of game. Well, that's one thing just by excluding from the process, I'll make my product better, at least for the taste that I'm going for and for the vision that I have. And so I wanted to ask about you being inspired by the sort of lower grade experiences that you've had, because that's obviously something that really drove me into the direction that I'm in now, where it's almost not even about me being the one to do it better. In my experience, in my case, it's like I feel like you said, there's so few good things or great things in the world, and so if I'm waiting around forever to find a great thing that is not just great to people who like that, but great to me because I like the thing that is, like an RTS, or in your case, it would be a platformer, right? Like, if you're going to sit around and wait, then you might be waiting a long time. Like it's just so unlikely that you'll stumble upon something, even if you seek it out actively and you like play every single thing in that genre. Okay, maybe you'll find something that's better, but really, if you're looking for something that's exactly to your taste, then you have to make it. And then you also have to learn more about yourself and like learn more about design and learn more about these disciplines on the one side, and then you as a person, as a designer, as a creative person on the other side. So a roundabout question is like, what are some examples of things where you were like, you referenced for N plus plus, or for the original N, that you were like dissatisfied with presumably the difficulty of these more casual games, but just in general, like a broad spectrum analysis, if you will, like what are some things that really irk you about the games that you've played recently, or like lasting experiences from even way back, that have motivated you to go into different directions?
I mean, I just wanted to mention, like, yeah, definitely, like, we're both very motivated by there are games that we want to play that don't exist, and no one is going to make them except for us. And I did want to mention, like, you're right that it sounds audacious to say, like, okay, I can do it better than these chuckleheads or whatever. But the thing is, your metric of better is according, like you said, according to your tastes. So what on the surface seems like a ridiculous hubristic statement is almost just plain sense, or like a tautology, where like of course you can cater to your taste better than random other creator. But the thing is, like, having said that, I still think like that's still a big motivator for us. And like, I don't know. I've been like, the thing is, I think personally, like, Mare is a very lovely person and she is much less negative than I am. And we provide a good balance that way. But like, I personally have just always been very complainy and negative, and it's something like I struggle with still, and I'm trying to be less negative, and I am less negative than I was, like, say, 10 years ago, for sure. Uh, so I don't know if I want to get too much into specific examples of stuff. But like, I mean, just like,
You could talk trends if you want. That's not specific to any real
yeah,
game, right?
I mean, like, okay, like I already harped on, but like the biggest one that I hope to push back on the most is stop making 2D worlds of just orthogonal squares. Like, it makes it's so much harder in terms of collision, in terms of game logic, even in terms of input and the various things you have to do to massage, like a D-pad, to work in an omnidirectional geometry world. But it's so stilted and boring, and the feeling of always being in a world of like a Sokoban sliding block world where, okay, if that's the kind of game, then that makes sense. But when it's in a platform or an action game, I want to slide, I want to be fluid, I want to feel, I want to glide through the world. I don't want my movement through the world to be a series of stilted interactions, or where the only interaction is I have to avoid things that are just going to kill me. Like, I want to be able to kind of rub, I want to, I want to, I don't know. I just want a richer set of movement and position based verbs and less stats. Like, I definitely am not super into games that use 2-digit integers or greater. Like, if your game design doesn't involve single digit integers, I feel like it's just kind of messy, or it's in a certain sense, like, but I think I'm biased from, say, Mario, right? Mario has 1 hit point. Super Mario has 2 hit points. That's it. Maybe you get a third hit point, or you get like a Yoshi that's kind of like a endlessly recyclable shield. But the idea is like arcade type, and I want to credit a game designer from Toronto called Draken, who made he made like dozens of cool games. But my two favorites by him are Probability Zero and Starseed Pilgrim. They're both like fantastically interesting games. But he phrased it this way, and it's what stuck. It's like single digit integers. That's what arcade games are about, because you don't want to do math, and also it just, you automatically lose that whole kind of deck builder, like, oh, you got +5 to this, where it's like +5 does not feel exciting. Going from 1 to 2 hit points that's exciting because now I can run straight through the next enemy and I don't even have to care. And that transforms the way that I play. It lets me do things I couldn't do with one hit point. Oh, if I have +5 poison defense, what, like, that? It's just not, I don't know. They're like, to me, so, but the problem is it's very hard. Like, as we've discovered, like, it's hard to design games using that because it's much more limited and I don't know. It's I guess it's more uncharted. It feels like more uncharted territory, and it's just harder in general because you can't fall back on spreadsheets, right? Like everything has to almost be holistic, and but yeah, it's like, but I mean, and I feel like that flows even. I mean, okay, Doom, the original Doom, had a kind of Dungeons and Dragons inspired damage and hit point system, which okay was more granular and things had 2d6 or whatever. Like I forget exactly, but they had like tens or hundreds of hit points. But I think what kept that game being smooth and flowing is the weapon design and the ammo design was such that you could always kill anything in like one or two shots, provided you wanted to burn that type of it. Like if you wanted to escalate, you could just get rid of whatever you wanted in one or two hits, which it's just like so many games still it's like I'm hitting this enemy like 30 times. Why? It's fun. It's fun to hit something and then it goes away. Standing there going like this, it's not fun. And like honestly, it's the reason why I don't like RTSs as a genre. It's like it's too much attrition. It's too much garden hose fights where it's like my hose is shooting out 10% more DPS than your hose. So eventually, and like I do understand there's tons of interesting stuff that happens in RTSs, but to me, as a core feeling, as the basic mechanical basis of the game and where the magic and the life springs from, I just can't get behind that kind of stuff. I mean, it's true, I have a problem with black and white thinking, and maybe this is just an extension of that, but I like Alive or Dead. I hit you once, and okay, maybe that just stunned you, then I have to hit you a second time, but like, please don't make me hit you 30 times. It's not fun, and it kills the flow. I mean, the whole game's been designed around that, so whatever. But it's like, I don't know.
I've yet to play a game where that actually feels good, though. To your point, that hitting an enemy 30 times or whatever. Like, when is that satisfying? Usually, if it's like more enjoyable than less enjoyable on the gradient, it's because of like you have to solve some other movement-based puzzle or whatever to dodge attacks in the middle of like finding the opening to the weak spot, and then you can hit. It's more nuanced than just smack the enemy in the head 30 times. But that's usually what you end up doing. And actually, another thing to this idea, because at first I was curious what you meant when you first broached the subject of like single-digit integers, is that if we take the counter example, like who thinks it's a good thing when they're playing like say Diablo 3, which God help you if you're playing Diablo 3, but say you're playing Diablo 3 and you hit an attack and it says 6K, like they have to abbreviate the number because it's so big. Like who has time to think about that? Like who can actually think in 6K, 10K? Like I think when you're abbreviating numbers, especially, you've already lost. But the losing trend happens way earlier, right? It happens like you lose players, you lose yourself as a developer, because as a developer, you're also a player. Like you lose some element of cleanliness and consistency and readability and all of these things that we like as gamers, especially if we're trying to test for skills and not just like more of a casual experience. You lose a lot of that if you're starting to crank the numbers up to a ridiculous extreme, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I did want, like, I guess I should probably caveat it all with like that. It's taste, right? It's like that's my personal taste and what I find interesting in games, and especially the dynamics of games that emerge from their mechanics. I feel like is more interesting. It's like in that arcade action element, I feel like is special and it gets lost. I did want to loop back on the casual games thing, and like, because it's true, like the whole N was a response to that, or like there's an element of that, but it's not like, because I don't like, it's like I play games on my phone. I mean, I play single pause on my phone. So, but it's like I like not every person who plays a game needs to be like Kasparov, right? Like they can just be they maybe have a stressful life and they just want to pop some like essentially like digital bubble wrap. That's fine. That's fun. But what we were pushing back on in the early 2000s was like games where it's like a platformer where you just walk. You can essentially just hold right and you get to the exit, and then like fireworks of like it's giving you all this like positive feedback, and it's like you're so amazing, but it's like can't like even like as fledgling designers, we already understood like you're just overcome like you're trying to give me a feeling of satisfaction that you can only earn through actual stakes and through actual risk and loss, and like that's what we've explored with those games. And like I feel like getting over it is hilarious because Bennett's body like succinctly wrapped up the dramatic arc of playing an endgame and the hundreds of levels condensed into one like perfect, brilliant jewel of the sense of stakes and loss, right? Where it's like, so we were just pushing back on that idea of like game feedback being vapid and the difficulty. I mean, part of the difficulty was purely like it was unintentional. It was like the awkwardness of the movement made it just a bit tricky. And also we were so good at it that we made levels harder than we thought they were, like the classic game designer thing. But a lot of it was like we recognized the reason it felt so good to beat that level was when I started the level, I couldn't beat it. I didn't know how to beat it, and I wasn't even good enough to beat it, even if you told me how to do it. I had to get better. There wasn't a little number of, oh, my hit points didn't go up, or I gained a new spell. My brain in the real world was forced to confront my shortcomings, analyze what I was doing wrong. Like, and psychologically, that's a turnoff for a lot of people, like, especially in games which they view as recreation or escapism, is you don't want the game to tell you you're bad. You don't want the game to make you feel inadequate. But at the same time, without that kind of feedback, without realizing you're not as good as you want to be, there's no growth. And so, like, I think we just recognize what we liked about certain kinds of action games was the catharsis of overcoming a challenge. And the only way you truly get the catharsis is you can't fool yourself. I mean, people do it in many ways, but, you know, like, to really feel the true reward, you have to feel hopeless. You have to like, and that's something I love about Michael Bro's games and just roguelikes, true roguelikes in general. Or even Spelunky is a great example of like, it just seems absurdly impossible when you start. Like, in fact, the whole premise of the game is you trust the designer enough to believe that if you can figure out enough strategic info and tricks and ideas, that it will become possible. And that kind of the delta from it's an unscalable cliff to the first time you claw your way to the top, like, it's just real. It's not fake. It's not like rainbow confetti and, you know, positively like little audio visual monkey brain tricks or lizard brain or whatever the hell brain it's simulated. Like, it's none of that. It's real. It's about like it goes on. It's like a conversation you're having with yourself that's only mediated or facilitated by the game. And that's like, I don't know, that's just something that we felt like games were lacking, or that we wanted to like sort of show or you know, represent. I don't know.
So one of the things that you brought up when you were giving me that answer regarding the games that you were responding to in the whole like casual games and the sort of fake dopamine almost, where it's like manufactured dopamine, I guess would be another way to put it, where here's the fireworks, you're an amazing player, but you didn't really do anything of substance. You know, I've personally been chasing that for quite a long time. The real element of the game gives you a set of tools. Like, let's go back to the analogy about if you give the player a pen and or pencil and paper versus the whole art store. So you give the player a set of tools, and still what they draw on the paper, what they do in the game is going to be in some ways unique to them if your tools are up to the task of allowing that. And I feel like that's probably a stumbling block for a lot of games, a lot of developers, is that a lot of the games feel like, even if it's not manufactured dopamine, it's still a manufactured experience, or as I've taken to calling it, the cameraman experience. And since I did tell you before we started that I'm most likely more negative with less experience, so I'll be the one who makes you look tame by comparison. I'll actually criticize Half-Life here, because that's it's not a sacred cow at all, right? So this game is obviously loved by millions of people. I feel like it's a cameraman game. I feel like you basically have some set pieces and elements of a story, and there are elements where there's open world or emergent gameplay where you can take different, tactics to get to the destination. But a lot of it feels like if I was watching somebody play as opposed to playing it myself, the same result would be what I see with minimal variation. So without necessarily commenting on maybe that specific example doesn't hold water with a lot of people. Maybe you disagree with that specific take on the game. I do feel like, generally speaking, that cameraman style of breaking down modern games, cinematic games, maybe, I think it holds a lot of water, because a lot of the times, they don't necessarily care to make sure that you have a lot of expression you can do as a player.
Yeah,
So
this is a whole
yeah,
very huge can of worms.
let's open it up then. What do you think about
Okay.
player expression?
I mean,
this is something you guys have obviously taken great care to develop in your own games thus far, with empowering the player, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I will admit I've never played the original Half-Life. I just wasn't I didn't have a good PC at that time, and I just wasn't into PC games. I don't even know if I was that into games in the late 90s. I played Half-Life 2, not to completion, but basically the gravity gun's amazing. That was a super fun, that was, I think that, the can of worms that I was referring to, thinking about, is essentially when did games kind of, in my mind, or to my sensibilities, they just, for various, it's not like there's a conspiracy, but there are systemic reasons why they gravitated towards this movie model, where it's the production process, so much of the AAA mindset views games as interactive film. And it's what I always try to think of is, it's games are as much film as games are architecture or dance. It's they're nothing, ultimately they're nothing like it. And I personally feel like games have much more in common with architecture than movies. And also, we took some cinema studies in university. So I was I was not exposed to a lot of art films, and it made me really sad. And it's something that I still feel really strongly about now. That it's so sad, because it's when film as a medium was first invented, no one knew, there were no conventions. There's the editing didn't exist, cutting did, there's all the conventions of film were gradually accreted, but also what we think of as movies today is a tiny fraction of the possibility space of moving images and sound. And there's insane. I mean, the only one I can think of off my hand is a movie called Serene Velocity. That's essentially just a shot of a sunrise in a hallway that they've then edited and rearranged in different ways to create a really strange effect when you're exposed to it. But it's the basic idea that I was exposed to there is, oh wait, the medium is very abstract in general and is capable of so much, but that gets filtered through what's commercially viable. And what's commercially viable is a familiar routine of the 3-beat story arc and the blah, blah, blah. And it's and as a result, this amazing, new, wonderful medium of film has now become it's just Marvel movies. And it's okay, again, it's the bubble wrap. I don't mean to be so negative. It's okay to like things and to need escapism and entertainment of that type, but from the point of view of the medium and the potential inherent in it, it's a travesty what happened with Hollywood. And it's I mean, there's probably an analogy with GMO crops, and it's gross. And I feel the same thing happened to games. And Half-Life probably is one of the progenitors of it. And I can understand the appeal. When Half-Life came out, I can see how people were probably really amazed. But it's personally, there's just so much. And it's not even necessarily about story and narrative in games, but it is in that so much of the Hollywood approach of making games, games as interactive movies, it's predicated on the notion of games have a plot that you can describe. You can describe what the plot. It's that. It's just does a bridge have a plot? No. It's not. It's not intrinsic to games and what games are. I mean, it's no one even knows what games are, and that's part of the thing. Is the umbrella term games is basically just any piece of interactive software at this point. So that could be literally anything, because computers are just a modeling tool, and they can model whatever you want the numbers to mean. So I can't really make any statements about games as a medium, I guess. But games as understood as coming from space war, coming from the concept of kind of a digital simulation of a world with rules, and the player is not necessarily an agent in the world, but the player manipulates aspects of state, and then that has followed. It's just like a feedback cycle of cause and effect, essentially. Like that's inherently at odds with a book, like a novel, and just like I was angry about this on Twitter like 5 or 7 or 8 years ago. Like we're just like there's like game writers. There's like a conference for game writers. I'm friends with some game writers, so I don't want to be too jerky, but like essentially the slides presupposed that writer was an important, like a vital aspect, a member, like you needed a writer to make a game, essentially, was the assumption that went into these slides. And it struck me as so ridiculously absurd. It's like saying you need a kung fu fight choreographer to make a movie, right? Where it's like, no, you're talking about a very specific kind of movie, and that doesn't like apply generally. And what makes me sad is it's like it's already kind of a fact. Like it used to make me very sad the way that AAA was gravitating for, let's say, business reasons, but also because it's hard to be creative. Like games are in game design is an endless black void that will drive you crazy and make you depressed if you think about what's out there undiscovered, right? So it's way easier to just iterate on a formula, and especially if the formula is not, it's like predates games, and it's something that everyone's been in our society and it was conditioned to understand how to digest, right? It's like, I think that's a huge part of it is just for whatever historical reasons, and no, not just historical, like people like people tell each other stories around the campfire, like whatever. People love telling stories, and it's an easy way to make something that is commercially like appealing to a broad range of people. But I just feel like that doesn't mean that it's doing the best job at exploring game design. What games can uniquely do, which in my mind is rules. You have a bunch of rules, and suddenly they interact with each other in a dynamic way that makes behaviors emerge. And it's a kind of magic. It's like an alien artifact that you can poke and prod, and it gives you feedback. And it's just so different. And the way that so many games still to this day, like The Last of Us, oh my God. So everyone loved The Last of Us. I played The Last of Us for 45 minutes. The first half hour, I couldn't get through the first scene where it's like there's like a stampede. There's some kind of like, there's a crowd running in a direction, right? So I'm in this game. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to cut down this alley. No, die. Okay, I'm going to hide behind this car. Like, if I was in a crowd, the one thing I'm not going to do is run with the crowd. Like, that's just stupid. Why would you even think anyone would do that in the first place? And yet, the whole nature of that intro sequence is if you don't do that, they kill you. And it's like, okay, why am I playing this then? Why not make it a cutscene if literally the only thing I can do is essentially perform the cutscene for you, but you're not even telling, like, it just, and like that gets into the whole like 3D games and like the whole, if you're going to have a door in a game and I can't open it, don't make it a door. Like, okay, it means you have to give up, have like, oh God, this is too big of a thing. But essentially, in my mind, the games that excite me most, or the thing about games that excite me most, is they're abstract. And as soon as you make things realistic in whatever way, you get into all these issues. And as soon as you try to shoehorn in some kind of fixed narrative, you get into issues. Now, there are story-based games that do an amazing job. Oh God, I'm going to forget. Ben Rivers made a game. I think it's called Home. Oh, I forget. It's like a horror game, and it's a narrative game, sort of, where there's branching paths. But the thing that's so good about it is he wrote every possible permutation of every possible choice that it could ever, like it took years. And as a result, it's just it feels like a game. It feels like a rich world, right? Whereas so many games, it's like, I'm cognizant that all I'm doing is navigating a tree of text that the game doesn't even understand. It's like, I think that's something, it's like the idea of position as a fundamental part of a game is the player can understand it and manipulate it as well as the computer can, because you can describe the math behind movement. A dialogue tree, it's opaque. It's like putting a texture on a triangle, right? Like the player thinks it's rock. The computer can't understand what that texture represents and therefore can't really manipulate it in any meaningful way. It's dead. It's like it's frozen in glass just fundamentally because of what it is. And so much of text in games is like that, where it's like it just doesn't fit. Like, it locks things into a certain structure. And it's like, at this point, it's like a genre. But it's a very prevalent genre of like the game that's really just a movie where in between I shoot people for a bit or whatever. Like none of the game is actually difficult in the sense that chess is difficult, right? It's like at no point during Uncharted do you have to think hard about the choices because it's not that kind of game. It's a game about jumping around and having fun and shooting people. And like that's fun, but I definitely feel like in terms of games being a very new medium that we're like, I don't even know if we're out of the silent era if we're going to make film analogies. Like, it's frustrating to see things already super calcified into this, like, you need a games writer. Like, I don't even think, I don't think you need text. I really feel like I mean, it's harder to design without text, but Hyperlight Drifter and Cinco Pals are two great examples. And like, if you need text, you're already failing in a certain way because you're trying to convey this information. Like, I mean, it's in tutorials, there's certain UI aspects of games as software where maybe text is a bit unavoidable, but it's like, in terms of providing feedback about the state of the world, that kind of thing, text is just so dead, and it just seems like it's I don't understand. I don't understand the appeal of it either, because it's like I read a lot of like specifically sci-fi short stories, but I read a lot, and it's like nothing in games writing is not up to the caliber of actual writing. And actually, we haven't even talked about music, but it's the same thing where it's like, and I don't want to say like I know game musicians, but honestly, I feel like it's weird to me that there are people who make music for games, but then there are these other people called musicians who like make albums and they go on tour. It's like, it's strange to it's like, I don't know. I don't want to like open up too many cans of worms. We should finish eating the worms that are already in front of us. But like, anyways, yeah, about like the movification of games and Half-Life and stuff. Like, I understand it. I understand what's appealing about it. I find it stifling and boring because like that's already been done. Like, or it's not even that interesting because it's like, what does that give you? What does the experience of being in a movie give you? Like, it's just a slightly different kind of movie. But like chess or Go, or like come up with like, the problem is we only have a few examples, but the space of possible games is like, there could be games that make Go look like checkers, and even like, or make Go look as messy as chess, right? Like, we don't know. They haven't been invented yet. Like Tetris, that kind of thing, where it's just like, to me, that's game design. Like, it's just brilliant. Like, sheer the magic of the interaction of a few small sets of things that you can combine in any way. And so playing them is about fiddling. It's about like messing with that alien. It's like poking it. You want to be able to poke things, right? And too much reliance on a fixed narrative limits what you can do as a player of necessity, because game AAA production quality and budgets mean that they can't do the combinatorial explosion of every possible thing you ever did. So they have to do fake funnels where, oh, it turns out anything you did ultimately gets you the same. Like, where it's like, why are you doing it then? You're doing it to provide an illusion of something. But it's like, when you're in a team of 20 people and there's 5 writers, you're never going to question, do we even need writers? They're being paid a salary, so you're going to use them. And I find that very, very frustrating. But I do want to point out, it's just because they're all called games. Like, even within games, like if you look at something like John Blow's work is a great example, where it's like the nature of puzzle games is essentially more or less linear. It's just a special kind of linear where you're not telling the player everything and they use inference and learning. But it's like, when you think about it, there's not really much playground in Braid. Ultimately, any puzzle game is very linear. I mean, it depends. Bubba is you. There's some examples where it's more about emergent, and like Cinco Pals is kind of an emergent puzzle, but like the Witness style things, right? There's one answer to that slidey puzzle. There's one answer, which means that it's essentially like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, to me, that kind of game is like, maybe that's like a sci-fi short story, right? And like your Half-Life, maybe that's like a romance novel, or maybe it's even like a cookbook. Like we have all these different words to describe types of written material, poems, dictionaries, right? Like technical manuals. but we like in games we call all of those things games, and and even the way that genre works in games is not like genre like movies. Oh, there's a western, or there's like Firefly. It's a sci-fi slash western, right? But you could have an RTS, and it's an RTS, but maybe it's a western RTS or a sci-fi RTS, or it's like the gaming press or just in general, like we've conflated the theming, the references to the real world that serve as shorthand to explain the mechanics of the game or whatever, however you want to call the set dressing. We call that like that's a genre in film, but in games it's like a flavor. And then the genre is RTS, and so it's like game genre is so much about the framing and the input output conventions of like the camera angle or how the control scheme works or the combat, like is there combat, like anyways, I guess what I mean is I'm saying all this stuff about games and writing and stuff, but it should be understood as essentially if there was a word for the type of game I'm into, that's what I'm talking about. And it's true, like what Half-Life did is it ushered in a whole bunch of cinematic games, and it's cool, like that's a new thing and it's a thing that exists. I guess I only dislike it in as much as I feel like it stole the AAA money and thunder that could otherwise have maybe found something new. But maybe it was never like maybe AAA is never where you look for interesting ideas. But I feel like and like maybe that's just purely a team size thing. Like because it's true, like in the '80s, AAA games were just as wacky as current indie games are. And I feel like it's more about there are 4 people making it, and there's less straitjacket in terms of what's marketing, how's marketing going to pitch this, so we have to, it's like that's not even a concern. So there's something else I wanted to say about the film thing, but it's completely slipped my mind. But like just the genres, like it's very interesting to think about these things, and like I've had a lot of bad experiences with like narrative games where it's like I mean, it's not even like I like we Mary and I both played like a bunch of Final Fantasies, and then at a certain point, like maybe Final Fantasy X or something, we realized like it's always going to be this barren tree of hallways with like maybe a chest every third dead end, and nothing interesting is ever like. And then we just never played another one ever again because like I don't know.
One of the things that struck me is that when you were explaining the whole like genre versus set dressing, it reminded me of the genre wars of metal back in. I was involved. It's probably still going on. I was involved in it in like early 2010s, basically. And
Interesting. I've not heard of this.
So yeah, so I was a big well, not big relative to other people, but I was really into metal music and the community. I had like for people who know the Metal Archives Encyclopedia Metalum. I was like a really avid poster there. I'd reviewed a ton of stuff. I wrote freelance, never got paid, of course. It's all volunteer work there for a bunch of websites, the Metal Observer, Global Domination. People who may or be familiar with this will be familiar with those sites potentially. And so I wrote a lot of stuff, and I listened to a lot of music, and what came up was this, like, whenever I would look at the comment section of a review that I did, or just a discussion on a forum about a band, there would always be like, people who would dismiss it out of hand based on the genre of music. Like there's things like, you'd think of like Disturbed as like a very mainstream band, and a lot of people would consider them mall rock instead. Like they would use that as a pejorative term. And then people came out with like, I'm trying to think of some of the names that unfortunately have. It's like it's not Between the Buried and Me. It's some other Bring Me the Horizon, I think, is the band. They're fairly popular back in their time. I don't know what they're doing now, but they were metalcore, and metalcore was seen as a pejorative by like really highfalutin dudes who only listened to like really extreme stuff. They just thought it was like very juvenile, and the lyrical themes were more whiny, and the vocals were more whiny, and they saw it as a bastardization of something that they liked. And then there was like the inverse of that. So it was something that came to mind because I think it's sort of similar to when people in games and in gaming communities will use pejorative terms they'll use terms like walking simulator as a pejorative to say like this is it's just an embarrassment, like by default, like it can't be good, just get it off my screen. And I was actually one of those people for a while, especially in my earlier year, like mid-teenage years. I was somebody who was looking at it like, man, imagine playing Dear Esther, or imagine any of these games that were like, they were indie hits at the time, but like I couldn't imagine actually wanting to play it because there was, in my mind, there was nothing to play. But that's, again, going back to your idea that all of these are called games, but we kind of have just a poverty of words to describe them. I think a lot of the issues that the genre wars in metal, or like the game genre wars, if you want to call them that, in gaming, a lot of the issues are just that people are calling it something that doesn't really describe it, but also lumps it in with a bunch of other stuff. And people are like, well, no, that's not anything like what we like. So why would you even, conflate the two? And that's like the people who like, fighting games that are really precise. You have to have frame perfect timings at the highest level of competition. And it's all about competition. It's all about getting better. Like those people are lumped in with people who play Candy Crush on their phone. And that's like, it's so different, so distinct. And you can even be good at Candy Crush. Like there's an element of skill that you can express. I'm assuming, I haven't played it, but I've seen like the game enough times to know that like, well, there's probably some pattern recognition and puzzle solving and stuff that goes on there. And even if it's on a phone, like, okay, you can still do something like that. But the gap between Candy Crush on your phone and like, fighting games at like FGC when you're playing like as like Mango on C9 or something like that. Like these people who are like top of the line competitors, like that's a huge gap. And people who are enthusiasts of one side versus the other are, I think, rightfully, maybe not rightfully, but they are affronted. I think there's a visceral response that's like, you're equating this thing that requires none of the skill or dedication with this thing that I like that requires all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's true. The thing is, I personally had a terrible experience with Dear Esther, like incredibly negative. I love Gone Home. Gone Home was great, and I do like the concept of walking simulator. I think is super interesting because it's like, why did it take so many? It's like, why did it take so many years? I'm sure there was a mod that removed this gun from Doom, like in the early '90s. But anyways, like I don't know. I don't know if it's like essentially. I think that, like, you're right. A lot of it is a knee-jerk reaction, and I'm glad that games are big enough that they encompass all these things. But specific to Dear Esther, I felt as I was playing it, it was like the last year I judged the IGF, and I used to be an IGF judge. And one year, like, I played literally every game, and it took me like a month. Like, I really was invested in it. And Dear Esther made me quit judging the IGF because I was complaining about it in the judges forum, and people were just like, no, it's beautiful, it's a work of genius. Like they were not explaining away any of the problems I had with it. They were just like, you just have to take it as a given that this is magnificent art. And I was like, so my experience was, okay, Dear Esther, there's a setup, you move very slowly and you can't jump. All right, fair enough. So I'm going through this world. Oh, it's a world where if you walk certain places, it triggers a sound and it plays a poem. It's like, okay, that's cool. That's interesting. And I'm walking through, and I only made it about 10 minutes into the game despite playing for over an hour because of how many times I got snagged on the geometry. Like, because they didn't, like, they if you don't give the player a jump button, you have to make sure you cannot get stuck. But I endlessly got stuck because I would see there's a little tunnel. Oh, I bet there's something, like, I bet I'll get more audio if I go to the end of the tunnel. No, it turns out they didn't want you to go there. And so it's like, and it made me realize, okay, I'm actually just like, this is like the most painful way to read a poem. And then later they released Dear Esther as a PDF, which is like, yes, this is what the work you made actually is. And I feel like that specific case was a very cynical, like, what's the commercial market for a PDF versus Steam? Like, and it's like a way of, okay, well, here's my kind of a totally, like, the poetry world is not going to be set aflame by this, but if I tart it up, those ignorant gamers won't have seen anything. But it's like, to me, it was very disrespectful because it showed that they didn't engage with the game part of it. They just kind of like co-opted it, where it's like, fundamentally, if movement is all you do, please have a very well-behaved mesh or invisible walls to keep me from not going to places you want. Like, if I can walk off a cliff and then get stuck and die and have to start from the very beginning and walk all the way back to where I was, agonizingly slow, like, that's the problem, is that it's like, I didn't even understand, like, it felt to me like whoever made it didn't care about interactivity whatsoever. They just wanted to express this thing. And I just feel like I felt like it was cynical. And I think Gone Home is a great counterexample because it's a game where, like, you could tell that the people making it understood about it's a game. Games are about people poking the world and interacting, and it's not gonna, like, it's like ridiculous to me how anyways, I'll stop ranting about Dear Esther, but just like, I guess it's a spectrum. And I do love that games are so, like, it's insane how diverse they are, and that the nature of it as a medium is that, like, entire fields don't exist, right? Like the first novel, or like think about now, novels are like, there's bookstores that are majority novels, but there was a time where the novel wasn't a thing. And I feel like that's where games still are. Like, there are still formats and idioms and stuff that are not yet explored. And it's cool to see that space gradually getting fleshed out, mostly by indies. But it also, like, I feel like some stuff, and also, like, I forget the guy's name, but the mountain guy is, like, clearly taking the piss. Or, like, it's like, okay, yes, everything. You made a game where everything can be in everything, but it's like, it's ultimately so lifeless and dead that it's just like, it's like, it just doesn't feel authentic. It feels like someone parachuting in from outside. Like, I don't know if games have a culture, but outside game design or outside, and just being like, I want to make some money, so I'm getting into games or whatever. But I don't know. But like, maybe it's just not for me. Maybe everything I like is like that too, and I'm just, maybe all my favorite books were, I want to kind of temper this criticism because I do feel like probably I'm wrong. That's the pattern that history has followed. But those are my feelings anyway. Those are like my heartfelt feelings on those games. But yeah,
well, it's difficult, isn't it? It's. I think it's really difficult to find some bridge between, there are things that it's not just that you could do in a video game, but that you, like, should do. If your intention is to make a good video game, you must do. But those things aren't necessarily what everybody's doing. And also, like, then there's also the class of thing that's more to taste, right? And so, like, I think, and maybe this is incorrect, or maybe there's some, like, counter argument to this, but I think an example of something that you must do is engage the player in the experience of interacting with the software that you've written and the game that you've put together, right? Like, using deliberately vague terminology so that I could encompass as many things. But if you're not engaging me, then, I mean, I view that as almost like a basic idea for a film as well. It's just that the method of engagement is different when it's a film. You're trying to get wrapped up in the characters or in the plot or in some element of the world. You need to be invested. And if you lack that investment, if you can't find that purchase, then that's like an example of, I think, an objective failure as opposed to a subjective one. And then the question becomes, like, is it always a failure for everybody? And that, like, can you even say objective in that term? Which I think is kind of like bogged down tautology and maybe not very useful. But if you were just to say, like, here's what is it? I'm intending to make a game that has quality to it, like a quality game, then there are things I must do. And then there's things that, like, depending on my vision and my taste, that I should do, or, like, that would improve it for the class of people, the class of consumer or player that would appreciate those things. And I have to, like, marry those two things. And there's, like, also, like, I guess some critical mass of things that if I do, then it's a bad idea. Like if I make this many mistakes, then my margin of error is that, and then it just is a failure. So it's an interesting, like, almost a puzzle of design to try and engage with. And also one that I think most people, like, to your point about, people just assume that, yeah, you have to have a games writer because games need narratives. And, like, somebody just decided that, I guess. Like, nobody's critically examined these, like, super low level elements, like these foundational elements of what an interactive software can be, what a game can be. And I feel like part of that is reflected in the lack of terms that we can use to describe the games and the poverty of words, but also part of it is just reflected in the fact that so many games feel the same. And maybe that you brought up, like, team sizes. And I feel like maybe you said a quote that you said was like, maybe you never look at AAA for interesting ideas. I feel like it's a lot of people and a lot of resources to spend on stuff that is fundamentally almost never interesting, at least beyond like very specific elements that you can say there's a kernel of an idea there. And if filtered through the right prism of design, I could see how that could be fun and engaging, or a component of something that's fun and engaging. But it's
Yeah.
obviously not shining brightly enough to add value to this. It's just like I have to really think in my head how to use that better, and then it can be valuable. Like that that describes a lot of AAA games for me, and that's I think a disappointing aspect of it. Where yeah, it is for me, and there's that element of subjectivity there. But I think there's something objectively wrong with the path that people have taken. And so I know you tried to temper your criticism with it's just about games that I like, or it's just about like these, my personal experience. But I do feel like there's a deeper fundamental reality going on where it's just many games are not good, and it's not
Yeah.
like a to taste thing. You know what I
Well,
mean?
I think it's easy to understand. I mean, I did want to say one thing about like the idea that there are certain things you just should do, or like I feel like I do understand what you're saying, and I broadly agree, but I also feel like there's got to be at least one example of a game that breaks one of those objective rules and is better for it. I can't think of a great example off the top of my head, but I just feel like it's fundamental. Like it's like you want games to be engaging. Michael Bro made a game that you can literally take one move a day, so it's kind of like pushing like, and it's like there are things like that, or like you don't want a game to delete your files, but there's actually an interesting game where things that happen in the game can delete your files. It's like I do feel like there always has to be an asterisk where even the most objective hard rules must have exceptions because that's just the nature of the beast. But getting back to the whole AAA thing, I mean, I think the thing is ultimately at the end of the day, and I don't know if this is true, but this is just what I fervently believe. It's just that you're relying on corporations. Corporations literally only exist to generate profit for their shareholders. You can't expect them to do anything other than that. And like, that's a whole other thing. That's the fundamental problem, right? So the only people you can rely on, it's like, okay, technically Metanet Software is a corporation, but we're like a lifestyle company where, because we're human, we have values beyond just money. Like that's what being human, like that's what the whole idea of corporations being legal people is ridiculous. Like at best they're like alien. They're like some kind of like cephaloid aliens, and they use us as their organs essentially. Like anyways, like let's not get into corporations, but basically they're not people. People have human values often based around morality and compassion, and for like we have a wide range of things motivate humans. Only one thing motivates corporations. So you just can't expect anything from corporations. Like corporations would grind up babies and serve them to you if there was a profit, if it wasn't explicitly illegal. And so it's like I just think you fundamentally can't rely on them. Now, in the 80s, when games got started, it was like this gray area where it felt like it was Wild West, and the corporations were maybe the only people that had the means to produce software. Like, I mean, I cannot conceive of like Pac-Man or whatever, where your prototyping involves soldering, right? Like game prototyping that involves soldering. Like, there's a scale of production where maybe you do need someone with deep pockets back then. But it's like with anything creative, at the end of the day, big companies where there's, as soon as you have one person who isn't invested in making it, like maybe they're an accountant or whatever, it's like you're already watering down what you're doing, right? You're not a rock band. I mean, maybe you are, but it's like you're a rock band where there's like one Beatle and like five Brian Epsteins or whatever. So I don't know. Like I feel like it's like the Occam's razor for why AAA is boring is because it's not their goal is not to do anything interesting. They'll do the minimum amount to be interesting enough that so that they don't lose market share. And if they can gain back market share by spending $10 million on marketing versus like 5 million on just blue sky R&D, giving, a bunch of teams $100,000 worth of months to make their, like, they're going to go with marketing because it's easier to justify, like, et cetera, for whatever reason. Like, I feel like it's absurd. If I was like EA, or if I had, hundreds of millions of dollars, I would absolutely set up an incubator, because indie developers, we love making games. We'll make games for cheap. Like, it's not like, I feel like, I don't know why more of that isn't happening, because if you have a certain critical mass of money, you can essentially you could just skim a little bit off every year as R&D. But I think as a society, this is a problem we have in general, not just in games, but even in like actual industry, where we don't prioritize R&D or pure science. We only prioritize commerce. And like you can see that our society is super stagnated for decades as a result. But anyways, I like this is all past, like, beyond my pay grade or whatever. But yeah, anyways, just like indie games. That's why I'm so inspired, and it's so awesome that like the internet happened, and digital distribution happened, and like itch.io and stuff, because like there's just an infinite number of really good games. Like in the early 2000s, there was a lot of freeware, and I played a lot of it, and very little of it was noteworthy. These days, there are a lot of noteworthy indie games. Like there's also a lot of not noteworthy, but like I guess that's just the nature of everything. But I feel like I'm inspired. I feel like it's just getting better. It's definitely difficult. Like the volume of releases is gotten to the point where I can't keep up with it, and I was really into knowing every game and playing every game, and but it's like I gave up years ago. I think curation and finding stuff is really hard. But anyways, yeah, don't I feel like small teams, small little rock bands, much better than like Hollywood as a production model. If what you want is a bunch of interesting, diverse end result, because the space you're exploring is so unmapped. Like you want to send out feelers in it's like it's it's like an infinitely dimensional space. It's very hard to cover any amount of volume or whatever. So I think Shotgun is the way to, like, a bunch of small little things, and that definitely doesn't map well to AAA. So, but I mean, there are certain things that AAA, like the infrastructure needed to make Battlefield 4 so fun, because like whenever I want, I could just play with 64 other people, right? Me and Mare are not going to be knocking out anything like that ever. It just, like, we couldn't. Like, so I think when they lean into their strengths, it can be very interesting. And they are exploring it's like Grand Theft Auto, and like there's things that are, but it's just like, yeah, ultimately it just feels disappointing. And like, even though that's bad, the whole mobile games and like free to play games thing is like a new, like a fresh level of hell that's even less interesting in terms of game design and even more problematic. But that's another.
That is, yeah, talk about can of worms. Speaking of can of worms, I would like to ask you about music, because I feel like that's a subject that you'll have some interesting thoughts on. My main concern with music in video games is that most of the time, even if the music in a vacuum is enjoyable to listen to, and I'll call out the Doom 2016, I actually find that to be really useful workout music. You know, if you're really trying to pump iron or something, like that's some good music to listen to. The way it's used, the way music is used in games is what really falls apart for me. Like the music can be great, but if it's not used well, or if it's like, in the case of Doom 2016, it's way too dominant in the mix. You can't hear anything else in the game. Like if enemies just sneak up on you, even though they're like titanic demons, and you can't tell what's going on, right? And so, I mean, that's part of the soundscape overall. That's part of the lack of like impact on sound effects. It's not just the music's fault. But that's like an example where music is actually, I think, a detriment to the experience, even though viscerally, so many people are like, I really like slaying demons to this song. It's really epic. But like in terms of, if you're looking to like improve as a player, if you're looking to understand what's happening in the game, like what the game is telling you and trying to like interface with that, actually, I think the music is getting in the way of that in some ways. It's informing, but I think it's not a net positive, or even if it would be considered, it's like too close to a 50-50. Like you want that to be much more like almost 100% positive if you're going to include it at all. If you harken back to the conversation about like making sure that all of your elements are justifying themselves. The other thing is you don't want them to be competing. You want, if the music is meant to be part of the soundscape, you almost want it not always to get out of the way, because sometimes the music is the driving factor. But if you're going to have music that's that frontal in the mix, I think you probably want the sounds to be notorious or notable, or you want a game where you don't need to rely on audio as much to actually like experience the game. I would look at like, not to once again go back to NPlusPlus, but that's a game where you don't need to like hear the audio. The audio cues can be helpful for like certain things, but it's not paramount. So if the music is hitting a crescendo, if you're getting into that flow state of like the music is, you know, accelerating and it's not slowing down, that's where you can actually do some of your best work as a player. You can actually, you know, hit that flow state really well, I think. So
Yeah.
what the roundabout statement is, and maybe something you can riff on, is I think a lot of the times games have problems with the way that they actually leverage the music. A lot of the times it feels like the music itself is it's sort of like a games writer. It's like you just expected to have a soundtrack. And I'm not sure that means it's tacked on or feels tacked on, but it feels less actualized than it could be. And so I wanted to get your take on that, specifically music as it pertains to video games, and maybe some ideas you have there.
It's so, there's just so much. Like, okay, so the first anecdote that sprung to mind that is something that really like blew my mind is, do you know the game Lumines? It came out on PSP, and like it's like
I never had
Sony,
a PSP,
like,
so I don't have.
Yeah, it's like I think Psygnosis developed, so Sony. It's all on Sony platforms. It's essentially like, in my mind, almost as good as Tetris. It's like the only one of those, you know, like this Puyo Puyo, there's like that genre of falling block puzzle games. It's the only one that comes near Tetris. It's pretty good. Like, I kind of got obsessed with it. And I don't want to go on a whole Lumines and how each iteration they fix some bugs and then ruin some aspects. But the main thing is, to understand about it, is that it's a game about music. It was made by Q, like Mizuguchi, who did Res, a bunch of like music game interaction type things. Medios is another, like, anyways, he released a bunch of games where it's kind of like playing with the idea of music in games. I think they also did, like, Every Extend was a Japanese freeware game, but I think they made a commercial release, like Q, not Pixel Junk Q, the other, there's two like Japanese Q game companies. One's Q Games and one's Q Entertainment. And I get them confused. Anyways, the Lumines people were kind of known for games, dance music in particular, and games. And so they made this Lumines, which is like Tetris with music. But the thing is, the music is important in that the mechanics of the game and when your blocks fall is synced to the beat. So faster levels, faster songs change it. Like, it really changes the feel. Some levels are just like at the end of Tetris where it's going crazy, and some levels it's super slow. And then you can make other kinds of mistakes. Like, you have to be, anyways, very interesting game. However, I got like into it and I was like high scoring it, and I realized I consistently did better when it was muted, when I turned the music off. And the whole premise of the game is it's all synced to the music. It's music is going on. Music. In the second one, they added like music videos that would play behind the game stream, which are like very distracting and also slowed, like the frame rate would just plummet. It was just like stupid for them to do. Anyways, music was central to this game, and yet I played it better, quote unquote, like when the music was off. And like, if the score, like, maybe that's an artifact of score being an indirect way for the designer to nudge the player towards playing in a certain way. But essentially, the conclusion I had was like, music in games is a distraction. It's always a distraction. But in order, like, the benefits sometimes outweigh the payoffs, because music it's like smell. It's something that connects with our emotions immediately and can be very, very strong in forming like a mood or a feeling. Like, you can see it all the time in movies or even in games. Like, I remember playing Journey. I was like, they went so hardcore on the emotional cello. Like, they're so, like, you can just tell when they want you to feel emotion because they blast the cello. It's like it's just like flood of like, and so, I mean, it's not, manipulate is the wrong word because it's just feedback and you're trying to solicit a certain response, but like, it's a fine line. And I haven't played the new Doom, but I have heard its music, and like, I've seen gameplay footage, and I can imagine, like, yeah, if you need audio cues to see what's behind you, and there's this like huge like synth metal going on, that it's probably going to drown that out. That could be, I could see that being a big problem. When we were picking the soundtrack to NPlusPlus, we actually had a problem that was similar in that a lot of the levels are stressful and harsh. And we thought, okay, we'll put some, edgy, exciting electronic music, but that made the levels unplayably stressful and unplayably hard. Like it just added a bit too much energy. And so that's why we actually ended up going with a lot more ambient and kind of ethereal. Like we didn't have any hard and fast rule, but essentially when we were playing the game, you want to kind of sit in the brainstem and just provide a mood, because N is such a dry game. It's very minimal. It's just basic solid colors. There needs to be some richness, and we felt like the audio was an important part. Like the sound effects are very organic and we tried to make them kind of like as unplain as possible. Like they are still ultimately functional, but the music was definitely the main way that we tried to provide an emotional context for the game. But it was also a tool to help regulate players' moods, because we found that if you play kind of ambient electronic music that's a bit calm in general, like dub techno, stuff that we kind of leaned in on, it helps players not get as stressed compared to like the four on the floor. There was one that we removed for licensing reasons that was like a real banger. That was like one of my favorite songs. It was really good. But honestly, like when it came on, you would just start dying, or like I would anyways. Like you could notice. You could definitely notice. Yeah. So it's really weird and interesting. And like actually another game audio related thing is how important it is even during prototyping. Like so much, because like humans are predominantly visual, yada yada, whatever. It's really easy to prototype games and not have any placeholder graphics, like placeholder sound. You need some amount of graphics if it's a game that deals with positions, and like generally there's some visual feedback, but it's easy to forego the audio. However, my experience is that a game that's just colored rectangles, like programmer art visuals with good sound effects, is more engaging than a game with no audio and nice art. Like, I don't know what it is, but the audio really makes the interactions come alive. Like, it's like fundamentally, I think a lot of the fun about games is like monkey presses a button and something happens and it delights our brains. And sound is just like really integral to that. Yeah, with like maybe that's obvious, but it's something that I feel like I consistently undervalue, or I overlook. And even like we're still prototyping stuff, and generally sound is added later on in the process than placeholder graphics, for instance. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a huge I mean, they say even about films, it's like 60-40 or something is sound, but if you were comparing the ratio of like what's important between sound
Mm-hmm.
and video, like audio and video, like they say 60-40, and they don't necessarily know which one is which either. Like it could be that sound is actually more important, even though you think of a film and you think of watching it, not listening. But I think there's a big part about that as well. And, you know, the thing about games for me is that a lot of the times you end up looking at a game, well, experiencing a game. So it's not just looking, like I just said, but you you want to really get immersed in a game. I want to get immersed in a game. I don't want, you talked earlier about text. I think text is like an example, dialogue text on screen or whatever is kind of like window dressing, but they made the whole game about that, instead of about a game. And I actually want to be able to say, like, I learned a lot from not just the dialogue, if there's dialogue, but I learned a lot from like, here's some part of the environment that's actually telling me something. And a big part of that is also the audio that happens. And you talked about like informing mood, and also that, interestingly enough, fast-paced games don't always benefit from fast-paced music. And I think these are really important observations. I didn't put it together like that, but what I was thinking is, if you are playing, like, obviously I come from an RTS background, you're playing an RTS and the soundtrack is distracting while you're trying to be a commander, which is really hard because you have to control units across a huge map and like build a base and then like do all of you have to micromanage all of these different things, and you have to multitask and juggle, and you're doing that, but you're also like, it's not just that you're listening to the music, it's that the music is like alerting you to its presence and saying, hey, I'm here. And you're like, man, I really can't think about that right now. I have to work on all these other things. It's actually too distracting. And so you want something that's evocative and informative and mood setting, but not something that is dominant or like overly indulgent in some way. And it's definitely like by feel you have to figure that out. I think at least that's the only process that's worked for me is that I
I
have to
guess it's
listen
like
to a track.
seasoning and cooking,
Okay.
where it's like you need it, but you don't need, like, you can overdo it maybe, or it can add tremendously, but can also ruin the whole dish if you
Yeah.
just put way too much of it. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I think that's one way to put it, right? And for me, it's just it's a really interesting topic that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough in as far as like gaming conversations go. Is what also like what the music can imply. So in the RTS that we're working on, we have 20 distinct factions planned, and not all of them will be at the same time because that's too ambitious for two people to do, by the way. But like it's a lot, and each one is going to have like 100 units. It's just going to be 100 unique like entities that you can train and stuff. It's crazy, insane scale. But one of the things that we wanted to do for readability's sake, as well as for like mood setting, because I think there's a weird combo where people who are like really competitively minded, like myself, they zero in on something that's like distracting and they say, oh, that makes the game like hard to read. But there's also an element where it's like, it's not necessarily something that is hard to read or easy to read, but in addition to whatever quality it has in that front, it's also like informing you about something. And the visceral feeling of something can be just as important as whether or not it's like you can easily read it or understand it, because there's something deeper that happens before you consciously read it, I think. But at the risk of going on a tangent on that, I'll just say that one of the things that we plan on do with music is we're going to have like melodies or structures or whatever, and unique like leitmotifs for each faction that you can play as.
Yeah.
And then when you do battle with a faction, or when one of them even comes on your screen, even before you've seen them, like you might see some dots on the minimap that alert you to like if you look at it, you're watching it, you're like, oh, there's an enemy unit there or something. Like as soon as that happens, before you even look at them on screen, you're going to hear part of their leitmotif fade in to the orchestration, and that the song like literally changes in real time. And that's something that like, yeah, music changes in real time in video games a lot, but a lot of the time it's like a loop that goes on until the combat ends, and then there's like a stinger that happens, and then like it goes to like calm, and that's like after the combat ends.
You're totally right. Like I completely forgot about that whole thing. I forget whoever the musician is that did like Fez and Hyper Light Drifter. They've worked on a bunch of interactive stuff like that, which is exactly like where they have a certain instrument or a certain melody represents a certain character. Like that's super interesting, and that's definitely something that I'd like would really like to see more of in games. However, it occurs to me that actually Super Mario World already, like, they established that's at least prior art. There might be an example before that, but essentially, like, the whole when you're on Yoshi, it adds congas to whatever the background music is. It's like you're right. It's like it's just something really fun, like super interesting, and it's unique. Like there's something that games can do with music, like a way of integrating music into games where it's not just playing music. Where I mean, that definitely someone suggested that to us early on, where it's like, what if the composition of the soundtrack in N++ was based on which entities, how many, if there's more minds, it's like this, and it's like we didn't have time to get into it. That idea is definitely, I think, super, really, really something that should be explored more, especially like because you already have the audio in STEM. So it's like the idea of our like music in general or Western music or whatever is like loop based and it's about repetition. You already have this nice structure where you can kind of bring things in and out dynamically and it already fits well enough. And making that actual feedback, making it representative of what's happening in the game is like, I definitely think, like, I wish I could remember the game that, like, I was watching a post-mortem and I don't think it was Hyper Light Drifter, but it may have been Fez, but I don't think Fez had too much dynamic stuff. But like, anyways, it was like a game of that type where they were showing some of the tools they had for making the music and how like rules for the stems being assembled. And yeah, I definitely think that that's really interesting. I mean, like this is completely unrelated, but analogous. I feel like in terms of graphics, that's another like visual style in 2D, especially like, okay, there's pixel, like there's like NES, Super NES type, like riffing on pixely retro things. Okay, what else is there? Like with N++, we tried to do Designers Republic graphic design, vector print, like really high res vectors. But like that's just like there's so many visual styles, and implementing them in the way that makes the game better. Like, there are a few games with toon shading where it's really interesting, like Wind Waker, it comes to mind, where I feel like it does create a really nice atmosphere, creates a look, but it's so unexplored. Like that whole, because it's a hard problem because it's about tools, it's about the asset pipeline, it's like a huge investment, and it's complicated, and it's like it's like cutting edge. Like there's like non-photorealistic rendering is an active area of investigation, and there's really hard technical challenges to, like, say, draw a 3D scene in the style of a watercolor in a way that's coherent, so that it's not just noise every frame. I'm really, like, to me, it's analogous to music, where it's like, okay, yes, we know you draw a nice sprite and you put it in the game. Okay, we know you make some music and you put it in the game, and we know that that works. But there's so much opportunity to be found in finding ways of making the audio and the graphics different. Like, just make them differently. Like, if you even if you just represent things differently, there's usually a knock-on effect that means that they get used differently. So, like, for instance, if you have your audio split into stems instead of just pre-mixed, you immediately already have all these extra knobs to twiddle with. And I don't know what an analogy to that is in graphics. Like, I know that Jess Mack, who made Everyday Shooter and Sound Shapes, like, her whole graphic system is essentially it's like a modular synthesizer for shapes. And all of the entity graphics, it's just formulas, math that gets plugged in to create animations and shapes. And, like, so there are some examples, but I feel like, yeah, it's such a tip of the iceberg thing that I'm excited to see more people experiment with, in a way. Like, I'm trying to think, like, I definitely played a few 2D games where they do something interesting stylistically in a way that actually makes the game a lot more interesting. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
That's okay. I always throw in like a guest recommends thing in the description. So if you think of anything after the fact, then we can throw that in there for sure.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah. So the other thing that, just briefly, you mentioned that you were trying to search for an analogy to the leitmotif, like the stems that change for music. I kind of have. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's not even for graphics. It's actually for dialogue. And it's that if you've played Duke Nukem 3D, then you know that when you kill somebody, sometimes Duke says something funny. And it's such a simple thing, but I actually feel like that is, maybe not revolutionary, but really important, and really, like, it taps into something that's really good about games, that is specific to games, that only games can do, where it's actually like we planned this for the RTS as well, where I told you there's going to be 20 factions, 100 units unique to each faction. That means that each unit, maybe not every single unit, but many units will have this thing where if you activate an ability on them, or you do something very specific, like they have something that only triggers if their projectile goes this far, and like that happens, then there's a small chance that as a result, the unit says something triumphant and like celebrates. And that will play for all players, not just you who is controlling it. So you can that's not like a thing that I don't think that positively or negatively impacts readability. Like, you can make an argument that, like, oh, when you hear that, you know this thing happened. But it's almost like an intimidation thing, or like a psychological response thing, where that happens, and like a unit that just killed one of your units laughs maniacally, and you're like, damn, like I just got my ass handed to me, or that guy got like you get this different reaction than if nothing happened. And the same thing is true in Duke Nukem 3D. And
that's so weird. I hadn't because the game that immediately sprang to my mind was Bastion, which is like the Big Lebowski narration throughout it, where it's like, it's responding to the game events. Where it's like, I feel like I didn't really like the game part of that game, and also that narration I feel like was, I don't know if it was heavy-handed, or they just didn't have enough alternate things for the most common things that happened. But yeah, it is that's a super fun idea. I forgot that about Duke Nukem and that strange connection where it's like, yeah, that's interesting. But
it's so funny because it's like, it's something that you're supposed to scoff at and laugh at. But in a way, like after a little bit of time, when you get used to it, it's like, it's actually kind of awesome in a weird way. Like, it feels like it's such a small thing that shouldn't be this important. But then, like, nothing happens in most games where you shoot somebody, right? Or like a player has to manually, like in Counter-Strike, you can like do a cheer, but you have to do that. Like your guy doesn't do that. And maybe that's for the better for the competitive integrity or something. Like you can make an argument that maybe it's distracting if they just do it, but it tells its own story where it's like more than you, like it's in reaction to what you did and what happened in the game, but it's also like more than just what you did, if that makes any sense, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like, I definitely think it speaks to the way that games are this strange, like, cyborg melange of like we don't even like I don't think we even understand what they are, and then they involve us in a computer as one organism. And like, sorry, because just for instance, with Bastion, right? Like, you could very easily swap out all of like instead of the narrator saying, "Hey, the guy picked up a potion," you could just have like a little sound effect, right? It would completely change the emotional effect, the reaction that players have, and how it's perceived. Like, it would completely change the whole game, despite from like a kind of narrow functional point of view. Oh, it's just audio. I'm playing audio in response to a game event. It's the same. But yeah, it's really interesting how, because so much of the game happens in our brains, and our brains are so mysterious and like there are several things at once almost. Like it that these little subtle things have a profound impact on the result. Like, I don't know, like I'm probably sounding pretty weird and stupid, but you know, it's like it's I just feel like it's easy to lose track of. Like, it's easy to think about game design as being, okay, well, this should be a 4, and this thing's radius should be 6, and you know, like kind of more dry things. But like a lot of it is just super experiential, super subjective, and like it's about the player's like lived experience of interacting with this thing, and the way that that can vary. I don't know.
Yeah, well, an example of this is if once again we go back to the realm of an RTS, or really you can apply this to anything. I'll take a shooter example. There's a game in 2017 called Prey, which for some reason was linked to an earlier game from 2006 called Prey, even though they were not the same game, but Bethesda. So anyway, you had a game where you were playing as this. You come out later. It is a spoiler. I'm not going to spoil it, but you're playing as something, and this thing. It's sort of like weird FPS RPG, but also survival, like gathering supplies and stuff. But one of the things that happens in that game is that like you're dealing with like an alien infestation of sorts, and not really you're trying to uncover like clues about how it happened while also fighting them. But one thing that never happens is like the environment actually changes, or there's like an event. Any event that seems dynamic was actually planned, and there's no chance that you didn't see it. Which actually, it sounds like, oh, you're making sure that the player sees it. But that's actually wrong in my estimation. Like, I think that's actually like so wrong, because what should in air quotes be happening is that like at any time this event could be happening. And if I stumble upon, like in an RTS, if I go through a scout the fog of war and 2 enemy factions are attacking, and I didn't even know either of them were in the map, like my brain then extrapolates that out, and suddenly I feel like the world is alive. And in Prey, if I encounter like a survivor or a turret shooting like an enemy, like an alien thing, then like that makes me feel like, unless it's all scripted, which it was in this game, like that makes me feel like the world is alive, and that there are things that I am not responsible for directly, but can choose to interact with, that are in the world. And that just doesn't happen in most games. And that's what struck me as like so wrong about that, is that it's great that you want to show me some things, especially if it's like tutorialization where you always see this particular event and that's like showing you that it can happen. But if you find out that like actually you could like lure an alien next to a survivor and they don't do anything, like then you know it's hollow and it was just there for your benefit or whatever. But it wasn't really there because the world is like that. It's just like they want you to think that the world is like that.
Yeah, it's like all a Western studio. It's just the front of the buildings. There's no actual building. I feel like the two examples that sprung to mind immediately were Dead Rising has the same thing, where it's like, in my mind, when I got Dead Rising, like I was like, I think it was after Spelunky came out. Anyways, I was like, okay, this for sure is going to be like, it's in a mall, and randomly you get a call, oh, come rescue these survivors. So I assumed like it was random. No, it's completely scripted, and it's in a way where it's like it wouldn't have even been that hard to make it dynamic, and it would have added so much to the game. And the worst one, oh shit, I've completely slipped my mind. I was just thinking about it.
You remember the kind of game it was by any chance?
Yeah, it was a first-person shooter. Oh, sorry, Alien Isolation. Whereas another, well, like I really enjoyed some elements, like it's that's one of those games. Same with Dead Rising, actually, where I felt like it had the potential to be amazingly good, but then there are just certain things that didn't work. Like in Alien Isolation, the whole premise of you're on a space station, the alien's on a space station, that's amazing. And maybe it's just because I like really, Bear and I were both super into System Shock and like that kind of more emergent game. Alien Isolation tries to make you feel that way, but like so often there's all these cutscene things that happen, and it's like it couldn't help but happen the way that it happened, and it drives me crazy because it's like you had this potential, you had like. I think that that's one nice thing about procedural generation in general. Like, even though a lot of games using it are not using it in a thoughtful, really awesome way, like Spelunky or Michael Bros games do, but it has the potential to just kind of undercut that problem. Like, that problem can't exist if your game already has to be modular because it's assembled by randomly connecting things to other things. Like, because I don't know, it's been a few years, so I don't remember any specifics, but I just remember loving Alien Isolation and then eventually realizing, like, oh wait, like I need to go there, and then that's going to happen, and then I'm going to go there. So really, it's just like Uncharted, where I'm allowed to play around in a little ring that looks like it's part of a big space, but I'm never gonna get over there. Like, it's kind of like the opposite of Dark Souls, or like the a thing that I think still makes Dark Souls like one of the most unique experiences for me is the way that the world is designed, fully in 3D, wrapped and intertwining around each other, so that you can see things that you won't reach for hours. Like, like it took like. I mean, I guess it's more like the first third of the game, but it's like I feel like so few 3D games are actually 3D. They're almost all on a plane. They're like, and just the idea of having a big world that the player can explore. There's something about that I find very fun, and just undercutting it by like, oh, it's all in like it's, I guess it's just like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain thing, where it's like, since it's a game and you have control over these things, you don't have to choose that design. You can structure it in other ways, and I hope to see more games doing that. Because, like, honestly, I feel like Spelunky times Dead Rising, amazing game. Spelunky times Alien Isolation, amazing game. Much better than Dead Rising or Alien Isolation, honestly, because those games are just like, they're too in that AAA mindset of like, this is what a game is, and it's like I think there's a lot of missed opportunity there, but.
Well, I think we could probably go on for a lot longer. I really enjoyed this conversation. We have officially cracked the 3-hour mark, so you're now the record holder. And I'm really appreciative of your time. So as a bit of a final send off, I don't know if you have anything any lasting message. You can feel free to plug Syncopause again if you want. Like, anything in particular that you want to send us off with.
I mean, yeah, I would say Michael Bros games, Brough is his last name, personally, I feel like the stuff he's exploring in terms of game design is unparalleled. Unparalleled just in terms of like how fun it is, how many possibilities. Like, I feel like there's this latent possibility about what games are, where they're models that the computer, it's like, okay, so this is too long, but board games can be tedious. They have all these like parts, blah, blah, blah. Having a computer do it is nice, but you need to use models that are still simple enough for the player to intuitively grasp. And a lot of strategy games are too susceptible to number crunching, right? Where it's like, the more time you spend staring at it and figuring out all the possibilities, the better your play will be. His games use randomness to completely undermine that, so that it's much more about developing the second order skill, right? It's like what roguelikes do in general, where you can't memorize the level. You have to memorize the strategies, the rules, the synergies. Like, he does that, like, just with game design in general, in a way that I find very fascinating, and I hope more people try his games and are inspired by them. I'll find a link to his website, but and I just like, I think they're fantastic. They're just like by far my favorite games ever made, probably. That's it. I wish I had something non-Cinco Palace related to say, but yeah, that's it.
We at the No Frauds Club thank Raigan for his time, and while no one really knows what games are, we hope you'll join us in our attempt to figure it out.